The monastery bells of Lindisfarne rang frantically in the pre-dawn darkness of June 8th, 793 CE. Not for prayer, for terror. Brother Aelfric was first to spot them, sleek wooden beasts slicing through the North Sea mist, their dragon-headed prows emerging like apparitions from another world. The young monk's warning shout died in his throat as the first arrow found him, punching through his woolen robe with terrible precision. By the time the remaining brothers had gathered in the stone chapel, the air already carried the acrid scent of burning thatch. They came ashore with brutal efficiency, broad-shouldered men with wild eyes and braided beards, axes and swords, catching the first glint of morning sun. Their leader, a towering figure with a raven-black beard and arms thick as tree trunks, bellowed commands in a harsh, guttural tongue that sounded to the terrified monks like the language of demons. Within minutes, the sanctuary that had stood for nearly a century was transformed into a slaughterhouse. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain, wrote the Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin shortly after. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. This raid on Lindisfarne marked the beginning of what would become known as the Viking Age, a period when Scandinavian warriors seemed to strike with impunity across Europe, from the frigid North Atlantic to the warm Mediterranean, from the dense forests of Russia to the deserts of North Africa. For 3 centuries, the mere rumour of approaching Viking ships was enough to empty villages, send precious church relics into hiding, and bring kings to their knees in desperate prayer. But history has a curious way of polishing certain narratives until they shine too brightly. The popular conception of Vikings as an unstoppable force, warriors without equal who conquered wherever they sailed, is one such overburnished truth. The reality, buried beneath centuries of sensationalized accounts and Hollywood reinventions, tells a more nuanced story. Yes, the Vikings were fearsome warriors who revolutionized warfare through mobility, surprise, and psychological terror. Their longships were technological marvels that allowed them to strike anywhere with coastal access, vanishing before organised resistance could materialise. Their battle prowess was legendary, with berserkers who fought with such unhinged ferocity that they seemed possessed by supernatural forces. Yet for all their fearsome reputation, the Vikings were far from invincible. Across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, they encountered peoples who not only survived their onslaught, but decisively defeated them, sometimes so thoroughly that the Vikings never returned to those regions again. These are the forgotten defenders, the overlooked victors in history's telling of the Viking saga. The Slavic Wends of the Baltic coast, who turned Viking naval tactics against them, and eventually conquered the feared Viking stronghold of Jomsborg. The Basque mariners of northern Iberia, whose maritime skills and devastating crossbows broke Viking raiding parties against the Cantabrian mountains. The Byzantine Empire, whose technological superiority and diplomatic cunning transformed would-be conquerors into loyal imperial guards. The Andalusian Muslims, whose rapid military adaptation crushed Viking ambitions in the Mediterranean. The Celtic defenders of Ireland, who evolved from easy victims to formidable opponents who eventually shattered Viking power at Clontarf. These victories weren't flukes or statistical anomalies. They represented systematic approaches to countering Viking advantages, strategies developed through bitter experience and refined until they became formidable defensive systems. Some defenders mastered coastal warning networks that eliminated the element of surprise. Others developed specialised weapons that neutralised Viking armour and battle tactics. Still others turned the raiders' mobility against them, cutting off escape routes and transforming lightning raids into death traps. The story of these successful defenders offers a powerful corrective to the myth of Viking invincibility. It reveals how innovation, adaptation, and resilience allowed seemingly outmatched communities to overcome one of history's most feared military forces. And it reminds us that even the most fearsome predators eventually meet their match, often in the most unexpected places. As we journey through the forgotten battlefields where Viking ambitions were broken, a pattern emerges, one that explains not just how individual communities survived, but how the Viking Age itself eventually came to an end. For the seeds of Viking defeat were sown in their very first encounters with those who refused to become their victims. The monastery at Lindisfarne burned, but elsewhere the fires of resistance were just beginning to ignite. The Viking expansion. To understand how the Vikings were defeated, we must first understand why they seemed undefeatable. The story begins in the harsh landscapes of Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway and Sweden, where geography itself shaped a warrior culture unlike any other in medieval Europe. These northern realms offered limited agricultural land, hemmed in by mountains, dense forests, and a climate that made farming a perpetual struggle against starvation. The deeply indented coastlines, however, provided something else: access to the sea in almost every direction. For centuries before the Viking Age officially began, Scandinavian communities had been developing maritime technologies to harvest the sea's bounty and maintain contact with scattered settlements. But by the late 8th century, a perfect storm of factors transformed these seafaring farmers into history's most feared raiders. Population pressure strained limited resources. Political consolidation under ambitious kings pushed disenfranchised warriors toward the margins. Climate fluctuations brought colder temperatures that further stressed agricultural production. And tantalising reports filtered back from merchant traders about the undefended wealth of monasteries and towns to the south and west. The stage was set for expansion. All that was needed was the means. That means it arrived in the form of the longship, perhaps the most revolutionary military technology of the early medieval world. Previous ship designs forced an uncomfortable compromise. Vessels were either seaworthy but slow and unmanoeuvrable, or quick but unsafe in open waters. The Viking longship shattered these limitations. Constructed using a clinker-built technique where overlapping wooden planks were riveted together, longships combined strength with flexibility. Their shallow draft, sometimes as little as 3 feet, allowed them to navigate not just coastal waters, but up rivers deep into continental interiors. A single large steering oar provided remarkable manoeuvrability, while their combination of sail and oar power meant they could move regardless of wind conditions. A typical longship could carry 60 to 80 warriors, yet be light enough for those same men to portage overland when necessary. They could achieve speeds of 10 to 15 knots under favourable conditions, faster than any pursuit vessel of the era, and most critically, they could beach directly on shorelines, allowing warriors to transition from sea to land in moments. Never before had Western Europe faced a threat that could materialise so suddenly, strike with such force, and disappear with equal speed, notes maritime historian Richard Unger. It was as if an enemy had developed teleportation. This unprecedented mobility translated into tactical advantages that seemed supernatural to their victims. Vikings could strike anywhere with coastal access, and in an age when most major settlements and monasteries were situated near water for transportation purposes, this meant virtually everywhere was vulnerable. The element of surprise became their most potent weapon. Communities accustomed to warfare that involved lengthy mobilizations and visible approaching armies now faced attackers who could appear on their doorstep without warning. Early warning systems, from coastal watchtowers to mounted messengers, proved inadequate against raiders who might materialize from morning fog or strike in darkness. The psychological impact of this uncertainty cannot be overstated. Contemporary accounts describe a paralysis of fear that spread across coastal Europe. The Frankish chronicler Ermentarius wrote that the number of ships grows larger, the endless flood of Vikings never ceases to increase. Everywhere Christians are victims of massacres, burnings, plunderings. The Vikings conquer all in their path, and no one resists them. This fear was amplified by deliberate Viking psychological warfare. They cultivated terrifying appearances with tattoos, distinctive hairstyles, and armour designed to intimidate. Some berserkers fought bare-chested or in animal skins, working themselves into battle frenzies that made them seem impervious to pain or fear. They executed prisoners in ritualistic ways intended to horrify witnesses and spread tales of Viking savagery. Most importantly, they targeted symbols of authority and spiritual power. By sacking churches, monasteries, and royal centres, they demonstrated that neither god nor king could protect the population. This undermined the very foundations of early medieval society, creating a crisis of confidence that often led to capitulation before battle was even joined. The early successes of Viking raiders read like a catalogue of medieval nightmares. After Lindisfarne in 793, the sacred island of Iona in Scotland was ravaged in 795 and again in 802 and 806, with 68 monks slaughtered in the final attack. The Irish monastery of Inishmurray was destroyed in 807, Roscrea in 8012. By 8020, no coastal monastery in Ireland was safe. Continental Europe fared no better. Hamburg was sacked in 845, the same year a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine to threaten Paris, departing only after receiving a massive payment of £7,000 of silver. Bordeaux fell in 848. Cologne was attacked in 862. Luna in Italy was taken through trickery in 860, when Vikings pretended their leader had died and wished for Christian burial, only to spring from the funeral procession to seize the city. Most audaciously, in 860, a fleet of 200 ships appeared before Constantinople itself, the greatest city in Christendom, temporarily threatening the Byzantine capital before being repulsed, a story we will explore in detail later. By the mid-9th century, Viking ambitions had evolved from mere raiding to conquest and settlement. In 865, the Great Heathen Army arrived in England. Not a raiding party, but an invasion force intent on permanent occupation. Within a decade, they had conquered 3 of England's 4 major kingdoms, establishing the region known as the Danelaw, where Viking law and custom prevailed. Similar territorial acquisitions followed. Parts of Ireland centred around Dublin, Normandy in France, literally the land of the Northmen, settlements throughout the Scottish Islands, and trading centres along the Russian river systems that would eventually give birth to the Kievan Rus state. At their height, Viking networks stretched from Newfoundland in North America, where a settlement at Lens aux Meadows dates to approximately 1000 CE, to Baghdad in the Middle East, where Viking merchants traded silver for Eastern luxury goods. Their ships navigated the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Caspian. Their warriors served as mercenaries for Byzantine emperors and Muslim caliphs alike. What force on earth could possibly stop such expansion? What people could stand against warriors who had humbled kings, terrified emperors, and made the most powerful church in Christendom add a new line to its litany? From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. The answer would come from unexpected quarters, from peoples history has largely forgotten, using strategies that defied conventional medieval military wisdom. The first to successfully turn the tide against the seemingly unstoppable Norse tide were not the powerful Frankish kingdoms, not the sophisticated Byzantines, but a collection of Slavic tribes along the Baltic coast who refused to become footnotes in the Viking saga. They were called the Wends, and they were about to teach the masters of maritime warfare a lesson in their own game. The Wendish resistance. The Baltic Sea in the early 9th century was a Viking lake, or so conventional history would have us believe, stretching from Denmark to Finland, from Sweden to what is now Poland and Germany. This inland sea served as the highway for Scandinavian expansion eastward. Its waters carried Norse traders toward the silver-rich Islamic caliphates and Byzantine markets. Its southern shores offered tempting targets for raiders seeking slaves and plunder. Yet along these southern shores lived peoples who refused to play the role of victims in the Viking saga. The Wends, a collective name given to Western Slavic tribes including the Obotrites, Rugians, Veleti, and Pomeranians, inhabited the coastal regions from the Bay of Kiel to the Vistula River. Their story represents perhaps the most successful resistance to Viking power in Europe, yet remains largely untold in popular histories. Who were these people who dared to challenge the masters of the northern seas? The Wendish tribes had inhabited the southern Baltic coast since at least the 6th century CE. Unlike the more hierarchical societies of Western Europe or Scandinavia, they maintained a decentralised political structure based on tribal confederations. Each tribe consisted of smaller clan groups centred around fortified settlements called grodi, wooden strongholds surrounded by earthen ramparts that served as political, economic and religious centres. Linguistically and culturally distinct from their Germanic neighbours to the west and the Norse to the north, the Wends practised a polytheistic religion centred around gods like Svantevit, a four-headed deity of war and prophecy, whose magnificent temple at Arkona on Rügen Island served as a religious centre for the entire region. Their society balanced agriculture with maritime activities, developing distinctive shipbuilding traditions adapted to the shallow lagoons and river estuaries of the southern Baltic. The Slavs are a numerous people, wrote Adam of Bremen in the 11th century. Strong in arms and swift on horseback, their ships control the Baltic Sea. This description, though written after centuries of Wendish naval development, hints at capabilities that would prove crucial in their confrontation with Viking expansion. The first recorded encounters between Vikings and Wends occurred in the late 8th century, coinciding with the beginning of the Viking Age. In 789 CE, according to the Royal Frankish Annals, the Danish king Godfred led a punitive expedition against the Obotrites, a Wendish tribe allied with Charlemagne's Frankish Empire. This early conflict set the pattern for what would become a complex three-way struggle between Danes, Wends and Franks for control of the southern Baltic. For the next 2 decades, Danish Vikings launched repeated raids against Wendish coastal settlements. The pattern matched Viking operations elsewhere in Europe. Swift seaborne attacks targeting trading centres and settlements, followed by rapid withdrawal before local forces could organise an effective response. The trading centre of Rerik, near modern Wismar, Germany, suffered particularly, as its wealth made it an attractive target. But unlike many other European peoples who initially seemed paralysed by Viking mobility and ferocity, the Wends adapted with remarkable speed. The turning point came in 811 CE, when Wendish forces achieved their first major victory against Viking raiders at Rerik. The Battle of Rerik represents a watershed moment in anti-Viking warfare, though reconstructing its exact details requires piecing together fragmentary sources and archaeological evidence. What seems clear is that the Wendish defenders had studied Viking tactics and developed effective countermeasures. The Viking force, likely sailing from Danish territories across the Baltic, approached Rerik in the traditional manner, a swift dawn attack intended to overwhelm defenders before they could organise resistance. But instead of finding an unprepared settlement, they encountered an ambush. Wendish lookouts positioned along the coast had spotted the approaching longships and triggered a pre-arranged defence plan. As the Viking ships approached the narrow harbour entrance, concealed Wendish vessels emerged from hidden inlets on both flanks. Simultaneously, land forces armed with bows and javelins moved into position along the shoreline. The result was a devastating crossfire. Viking longships, designed for speed and surprise attacks rather than pitched naval battles, found themselves trapped in confined waters with limited manoeuvrability. Contemporary accounts suggest the Wends had prepared their battlefield by driving underwater stakes into the harbour approaches, creating hazards that damaged Viking hulls and restricted their movement to predictable channels. The Danes came seeking plunder but found only death, wrote a Frankish chronicler with evident satisfaction at the misfortune of these mutual enemies. The Slavs took 7 ships and killed many men, while the rest fled in disgrace. This victory revealed the emerging Wendish counter-strategy against Viking raids. Rather than attempting to match Viking warriors in direct combat, where their fearsome reputation and battle skills gave them an edge, The Wends focused on neutralising the key Viking advantage, naval mobility. The cornerstone of this strategy was the development of specialised vessels adapted for anti-Viking warfare. Archaeological discoveries in the Baltic region have revealed distinctively Slavic ship designs from this period that differed significantly from Scandinavian longships. The Wendish craft featured extremely shallow drafts, sometimes as little as 50 centimetres, allowing them to navigate waters too shallow for the deeper-keeled Viking vessels. This design choice was strategically brilliant. It transformed the complex coastline of the southern Baltic, with its many lagoons, river mouths, and shallow bays, from vulnerable access points into defensive assets. Wendish vessels could retreat into waters where Viking ships couldn't follow, launch ambushes from concealed positions in reedy shallows, and maintain escape routes that remained inaccessible to their pursuers. The Slavic ships move silently through waters where no others can go, noted one contemporary observer. They appear and vanish like ghosts among the reeds. Beyond vessel design, the Wends developed a sophisticated early warning system based on hilltop signal fires and messenger networks. Archaeological evidence shows chains of promontory forts along the Baltic coast, positioned to provide interlocking fields of vision across the approaches to major settlements. When Viking sails were spotted on the horizon, warning signals could travel dozens of miles in minutes, giving communities crucial time to prepare defences or evacuate valuables. The Wends also adopted guerrilla tactics that exploited their intimate knowledge of local geography. Rather than meeting Viking raiders on beaches where the Northmen excelled at forming shield walls, Wendish defenders would allow landing parties to move inland before ambushing them in forests or marshes where their heavy weapons and armour became disadvantages. They developed specialised weapons for these environments, including the infamous Wendish stirrup, a concealed spike trap that could lame Viking warriors and their horses. Perhaps most importantly, the Wends recognised that offence could be the best defence. By the mid-9th century, they had begun launching counter-raids against Danish coastal settlements, striking when Viking fleets were away on distant expeditions. These operations served both practical purposes, gathering intelligence, capturing ships and securing plunder, and psychological ones, demonstrating that Viking homelands were not inviolable. The effectiveness of these combined strategies became evident in the changing pattern of Viking activity in the region. By the 800s and 50s, Danish raids against Wendish territories had decreased significantly, with Viking attention shifting to softer targets in Western Europe and the British Isles. When conflicts did occur, they increasingly took the form of formal military campaigns backed by royal authority rather than opportunistic raids, a tacit acknowledgement that the Wends could not be easily overwhelmed by traditional Viking tactics. The culmination of Wendish resistance came in the late 10th century with their successful assault on Jomsborg, the legendary Viking stronghold, established on Wendish territory near modern Wolin, Poland. According to Norse sagas and archaeological evidence, Jomsborg had served as a base for the Jomsvikings, an elite Viking military company that terrorised the Baltic region for decades. The fall of Jomsborg to Wendish forces around 980 to 990 CE represents perhaps the most significant reversal of Viking fortunes in the Baltic. Led by the Obotrite prince Mustivoj, and possibly allied with Polish forces under Mieszko I, the Wends besieged the fortress, both by land and sea. The exact details of the campaign vary between sources, but the archaeological record confirms a violent destruction of the settlement, followed by its reoccupation under Slavic control. The fortress that the Northmen believed impregnable fell to the people they had once preyed upon, notes archaeologist Władysław Filipowiak, who excavated the site. The weapons found in the destruction layer tell a story of intense hand-to-hand combat, with the defenders fighting room by room as their stronghold was overrun. The legacy of Wendish resistance extends beyond these military victories. Archaeological excavations throughout the southern Baltic region have yielded evidence of their successful defensive adaptations, specialised weapons designed to counter Viking armour and tactics. fortifications positioned to control key waterways, and shipyards that produced vessels specifically designed for shallow water warfare. Place names along the Baltic coast still bear witness to this forgotten conflict. The very name Volin, the island where Jomsborg stood, derives from the Old Norse Valin, meaning the chosen or the fallen, perhaps commemorating the Vikings who died attempting to hold this outpost against Wendish counterattacks. Most significantly, the Wendish example demonstrated that Viking naval supremacy, the cornerstone of their military power, could be effectively countered through asymmetric warfare and technological adaptation. This lesson would be independently discovered by other peoples facing Viking aggression, from the Basques of northern Spain to the Byzantine defenders of Constantinople. The Wends had proven that the masters of the northern seas could be beaten at their own game, and they weren't alone in this discovery. Far to the southwest, along the storm-racked Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, another maritime people was developing their own solutions to the Viking threat. Solutions that would permanently end Norse ambitions in the region. The Basque response. When the first Viking longships appeared off the northern coast of Iberia in the early 9th century, they encountered something unexpected, a people whose maritime traditions rivaled their own. The Basques, that ancient, linguistically isolated people inhabiting the western Pyrenees Mountains and adjacent coastal regions, had been seafarers since time immemorial. Their origins remain one of European anthropology's great mysteries. Their language, Euskara, shares no common roots with any other known tongue. What is certain is that by the time they faced Viking raiders, the Basques had developed maritime skills that would prove crucial to their survival. Before there were Vikings, there were Basque whalers, goes an old saying in the coastal towns of Gipuzkoa and Biscaya. This is no mere boast. Archaeological and documentary evidence confirms that Basque mariners had been hunting whales in the Bay of Biscay since at least the 6th century CE, developing specialised vessels and harpoon techniques for pursuing these leviathans in some of Europe's most treacherous waters. This whaling tradition produced a maritime culture of exceptional quality. Basque shipwrights crafted vessels designed to withstand the notorious storms of the Cantabrian Sea. Their sailors navigated by stars and currents, developing intimate knowledge of coastal features. Most importantly, Basque coastal communities maintained a tradition of collective defence. When whaling boats sighted danger, complex systems of signal fires and church bells could mobilise entire villages within minutes. These capabilities would be tested to their limits when Norse raiders arrived seeking new territories to plunder after their successful campaigns in the British Isles and Francia. The first recorded Viking incursion into Basque territories came in 844 CE, when a fleet of approximately 80 ships that had previously attacked Gijón in Asturias continued eastward along the Cantabrian coast. Contemporary chronicles describe how these raiders, likely originating from Norway based on ship design and artefacts later recovered from shipwrecks, probed the Basque coastline seeking vulnerable targets. What they discovered instead was a coastline bristling with defences. Unlike many European regions where Vikings could exploit flat beaches for easy landings, the Basque coast presented a formidable natural barrier, steep cliffs interspersed with narrow beach landings that could be easily monitored and defended. The few natural harbours served as bases for Basque fishing and whaling fleets, which meant potential landing sites were under constant observation by experienced mariners. The northern men found no easy prey on these shores, wrote an anonymous chronicler from the monastery of San Salvador de Leyre. Where they sought to land, they found men waiting with weapons in hand, for the sea people of Vasconia watched their waters as a mother watched her child. This vigilance translated into an effective early warning system. Archaeological excavations have revealed the remains of watchtowers positioned at strategic points along the Basque coast, many predating the Viking Age and likely established as defences against earlier maritime threats from Moorish raiders or Frankish expansionism. These towers, typically situated on promontories with clear sightlines to adjacent stations, could relay signals rapidly along the coast. When Viking sails were spotted, warning fires would be lit, triggering a cascade of responses. Church bells would ring in coastal villages, calling able-bodied men to defensive positions. Livestock and valuables would be moved inland. And most importantly, Basque maritime forces would mobilise. It was this last element that truly distinguished the Basque response from other European defences. While many regions relied solely on land-based forces to repel Viking raiders after they came ashore, the Basques met the threat on the water itself. The confrontation that best exemplifies this approach occurred in 858 CE at the mouth of the Oria River near present-day Orio, Gipuzkoa. According to local chronicles and archaeological evidence, a Viking fleet of approximately 30 ships attempted to navigate upriver to attack inland settlements and the valuable monastery of San Salvador do Surbil. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetric naval warfare. Rather than attempting to match the Vikings ship for ship in open water, where the superior speed and manoeuvrability of longships would give the raiders an advantage, the Basques implemented a sophisticated trap. As the Viking fleet entered the river estuary at high tide, they encountered no immediate resistance. The narrow channel forced them to proceed in a stretched formation, with only a few ships able to navigate the passage side by side. What the raiders couldn't know was that Basque defenders had spent the previous days subtly altering the riverbed, using their intimate knowledge of local tides and currents. At specific points, they had driven wooden stakes into the river bottom, positioned to remain hidden at high tide, but become hazardous obstacles as the water receded. They had also strategically weakened certain sandbanks to create deceptive channels that would strand unwary vessels. The trap was sprung when the tide began to ebb. The lead Viking ships, having penetrated deepest into the estuary, suddenly found themselves scraping bottom on hidden shoals or impaled on submerged stakes. As the formation compressed with vessels unable to advance or retreat, Basque forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. From concealed positions along wooded riverbanks, Basque archers unleashed volleys of arrows. More significantly, they deployed crossbows, weapons still relatively uncommon in 9th century warfare, but particularly effective against the lightly armoured Viking raiders. The crossbow's ability to penetrate shields and mail at distance gave Basque defenders a crucial technological edge. Meanwhile, smaller Basque vessels emerged from hidden inlets and tributary streams. These chalupas, shallow draft boats normally used for coastal fishing and whaling, carried warriors armed with boarding axes and grappling hooks. Too small to be targeted effectively by Viking archers and too numerous to be fought off simultaneously, they swarmed the stranded longships. The Northmen found themselves caught like wolves in a pit, recorded a contemporary account. Their great ships became their prisons as the tide abandoned them. The men of Vasconia came from all sides, from the water and from the land, and made such slaughter that the river ran red to the sea. Archaeological excavations in the Oria estuary have confirmed elements of this account, uncovering Viking weapons, ship fittings, and human remains dating to the mid-9th century, in context suggesting a major naval disaster. Analysis of these artefacts indicates the raiders originated from Norwegian rather than Danish territories, consistent with the broader pattern of Norwegian Viking activity along the Atlantic seaboard. The Battle of the Oria River, as it came to be known, established a pattern for Basque anti-Viking operations that would be repeated successfully throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. Rather than attempting to match Viking strengths, Basque defenders systematically targeted their vulnerabilities. They neutralised the Vikings' navigational advantage by luring them into treacherous coastal waters where local knowledge proved decisive. They countered Viking mobility by choosing battlegrounds where longship speed and manoeuvrability became irrelevant or even disadvantageous. They negated the shock value of Viking berserker charges by engaging at distance with crossbows or from advantageous positions that prevented the formation of shield walls. Perhaps most importantly, the Basques developed a defensive system that eliminated the Vikings' crucial element of surprise. The combination of coastal watchtowers, signal networks and rapid response protocols meant raiders rarely achieved the unopposed landings that had made their attacks so devastating elsewhere in Europe. The technological edge provided by Basque crossbows deserves special attention. These weapons represented a significant innovation in the 9th century warfare, particularly in maritime contexts. Unlike conventional bows that required years of training to use effectively, crossbows could be mastered relatively quickly and maintained at full draw until the optimal moment to release, ideal for ambush tactics. Archaeological evidence from Basque coastal sites of this period shows sophisticated crossbow design, including the use of composite materials and spanning mechanisms that increased power while reducing the strength required to operate them. Crossbow bolts recovered from Viking Age contexts show specialised heads designed to penetrate the ringmail commonly worn by Norse warriors. The Basques employed weapons that could kill a man at 200 paces, noted a later chronicler. Their bolts struck with such force that neither shield nor mail could turn them aside, and the Northmen feared them as they feared no other foe. This technological advantage was magnified by the Basques' defensive architecture. Archaeological excavations have revealed a network of coastal fortifications dating to this period, strategically positioned to control access to river mouths, natural harbours, and beach landing sites. These structures typically combined stone towers for observation with earthwork enclosures that could shelter local populations during raids. Most ingeniously, many Basque coastal churches from this era were designed with defensive capabilities. The Church of San Salvador de Guetaria, for instance, incorporated thick walls, narrow windows suitable for archery, and a commanding position overlooking the harbour, allowing it to serve as both spiritual centre and defensive strongpoint. Bell towers doubled as watchtowers, with church bells serving as warning systems that could alert entire communities within minutes. The cumulative effect of these innovations was to make the Basque coastline increasingly inhospitable to Viking raiders. After a series of costly failures in the 860s and 870s, Norse expeditions to the region became increasingly rare. By the late 9th century, Viking fleets were actively avoiding Basque territories, preferring to strike at less well-defended regions in southern Iberia or to bypass the peninsula entirely on their voyages to the Mediterranean. This successful resistance had profound effects on Basque culture and identity. Coastal communities developed a tradition of maritime militias, with fishing and whaling crews doubling as naval defence forces. Folkloric traditions celebrating victories over the northern wolves emerged, with annual festivals commemorating successful defences against Viking raids. Archaeological evidence shows increased prosperity in Basque coastal settlements during the late 9th and 10th centuries, a stark contrast to many European regions devastated by Viking attacks during the same period. The Basque experience offers crucial insights into successful anti-Viking strategies. Like the Wends of the Baltic, they demonstrated that Norse raiders could be decisively defeated when their key advantages, surprise, mobility, and psychological terror, were systematically neutralised. Their success relied not on fielding larger armies or building impregnable fortifications, but on developing integrated defensive systems that combined technology, local knowledge, and rapid response capabilities. Most significantly, both the Wends and the Basques showed that maritime peoples with their own naval traditions were uniquely positioned to counter Viking aggression. Their success would find parallels in the Byzantine response to Rus Viking raids in the Black Sea, and the Andalusian Muslim defences against Norse incursions in the Mediterranean, examples we will explore in the next section of our journey. The Vikings who survived the disaster at the Oria River carried tales of the sea demons of the southern mountains back to their Norwegian homelands. These accounts, preserved in later Norse sagas, speak with grudging respect for enemies who matched their own maritime prowess. One saga describes the Basques as men born from the marriage of the mountains and the sea, who fight like wolves and know waters no other men would dare to sail. It was a hard-earned reputation that would ensure the Basque coastline remained secure, while Viking raiders sought easier targets elsewhere. And it demonstrated a crucial truth that would be rediscovered by defenders across Europe and beyond. The Vikings were not invincible. They could be beaten, and the methods that defeated them would ultimately contribute to the end of the Viking Age itself. As we turn our attention eastward, we will discover how the sophisticated Byzantine Empire developed its own solutions to the Viking threat. Solutions that would transform Norse raiders from enemies into elite imperial guardsmen through a combination of technological superiority, diplomatic cunning, and cultural assimilation. Strategies of resistance. The Byzantine defence. While the Wends and Basques were developing their responses to Viking aggression in the Baltic and Atlantic, another confrontation was unfolding far to the southeast. Here, Norse adventurers who had navigated the complex river systems of Eastern Europe encountered a power unlike any they had faced before: the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople in the 9th century was no ordinary prize. It was the greatest city in Christendom, perhaps in the entire world, with a population approaching 500,000 souls. Its massive walls, strengthened and expanded by Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, created a virtually impregnable land defence. 3 separate lines of fortifications, with walls up to 40 feet high, protected by 96 towers and a moat 60 feet wide. For over 5 centuries, these defences had withstood dozens of sieges by Avars, Arabs, Bulgars and other would-be conquerors. But it was not just Constantinople's physical defences that made it exceptional. The city represented the continuation of Roman imperial tradition, maintaining administrative, military and cultural sophistication at a time when Western Europe had fragmented into competing kingdoms. The Byzantine Empire possessed a professional standing army, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and technological capabilities far beyond its contemporaries. For the Vikings, or more specifically, the Rus, as the Eastern Vikings who had settled among Slavic populations were known, Constantinople represented the ultimate target. Arab geographer Ibn Khordadbeh wrote that the Rus traders described it as the city of cities, the greatest of all settlements. Its wealth was legendary. The golden domes of its churches, the vast imperial treasuries, the bustling markets where goods from 3 continents changed hands. The Rus had first encountered Byzantine power through trade. By the early 9th century, Norse merchants had established a presence in Eastern Europe, using the river systems of modern-day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine as highways to reach the Black Sea and, ultimately, Constantinople itself. Archaeological evidence from settlements like Staraya Ladoga shows Scandinavian presence as early as the mid-8th century, with Norse artefacts intermingled with local Slavic and Finnic materials. These initial commercial contacts were largely peaceful. A treaty dating to 907 CE between Prince Oleg of Kiev and Byzantine Emperor Leo VI regulated trade relations, establishing quotas for Rus merchants in Constantinople and detailing procedures for their accommodation. But alongside legitimate trade, the temptation of Byzantine wealth inevitably attracted more predatory attention. The first major Rus attack on Constantinople came in June 860 CE. According to the Byzantine patriarch Photios, who witnessed the event, a people dwelling somewhere in the north appeared without warning in the Bosporus with a fleet of 200 ships. The timing was opportune for the attackers. Emperor Michael III and the main Byzantine army were campaigning against Arab forces in Anatolia, leaving the capital lightly defended. For several days, the Rus raiders ravaged the suburbs outside Constantinople's walls, destroying monasteries, burning villages, and slaughtering or enslaving the population. They surrounded the city by sea, their ships forming what one contemporary described as a floating forest around the coastline. The population, taken completely by surprise, crowded into the city as refugees, while the remaining defenders manned the walls. The attack ultimately failed. Unable to breach Constantinople's land walls and facing unexpected resistance from the city's naval defences, the Rus withdrew after approximately 1 week. They had inflicted significant damage on the surrounding countryside, but failed to capture their primary prize. This initial encounter revealed both Byzantine vulnerabilities and strengths. The empire had been caught unprepared, with inadequate early warning of the approaching threat. Yet even with the emperor and main field army absent, Constantinople's defences had proven sufficient to repel the attack. Most importantly, the raid served as a wake-up call that prompted a systematic Byzantine response to the new northern threat. That response centred around 3 interlocking strategies: naval superiority, intelligence networks, and diplomatic countermeasures. Together, they would transform the Rus from dangerous enemies into valuable allies and eventually into the empire's most elite defenders. The cornerstone of Byzantine defence against seaborne threats was technological superiority, embodied most dramatically in the weapon known as Greek fire. First developed in the 7th century during the Arab sieges of Constantinople, this incendiary weapon represented military technology centuries ahead of its time. Contemporary accounts describe Greek fire as a liquid that ignited upon contact with water, a property that made it devastatingly effective in naval combat. It was projected through bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships, creating jets of flame that could engulf enemy vessels. The exact composition remained a closely guarded state secret, with knowledge of its manufacture restricted to a single family who passed the formula from father to son. Modern chemical analysis of archaeological residues suggests Greek fire likely contained petroleum, naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, and resin, a mixture that would indeed ignite on contact with water and prove nearly impossible to extinguish. The psychological impact on enemies unfamiliar with the substance was profound. Leo the Deacon described Rus warriors jumping into the sea when struck by Greek fire, preferring the water to being consumed by the dreadful flames. This wonder weapon was deployed from specialised Byzantine warships called dromones, swift, manoeuvrable galleys that formed the backbone of imperial naval power. Unlike Viking longships, which prioritised speed and shallow draft for raiding operations, dromones were purpose-built warships designed for naval dominance. They featured reinforced rams, multiple banks of oars, and elevated fighting platforms that gave their archers commanding fields of fire over lower-built vessels. Most importantly, dromones carried significantly larger crews than Viking ships, typically 200 men compared to the 60 to 80 of a large longship. This numerical advantage, combined with technological superiority, made Byzantine naval forces formidable opponents, even when outnumbered in terms of vessels. The empire maintained these naval forces in a state of constant readiness through the thematic system, an administrative structure that allocated specific regions, themes, responsibility for maintaining military forces. The naval themes, particularly the Kibarayot theme in southern Anatolia, provided both ships and trained crews that could be rapidly mobilised to counter maritime threats. This naval superiority was demonstrated decisively during the second major Rus attack on Constantinople in 941 CE. Led by Prince Igor of Kiev, a fleet of approximately 1,000 ships, likely an exaggerated figure in Byzantine sources, approached the capital, while Emperor Romanos I Lekapenos was again occupied with threats elsewhere. This time, however, the Byzantines were prepared. The imperial navy, though reduced to only 15 dromones according to contemporary accounts, engaged the Rus fleet in the Bosporus. The result was a devastating defeat for the attackers. Byzantine ships deployed Greek fire with devastating effect, igniting dozens of the wooden Rus vessels. Thousands of warriors drowned or burned to death as their ships were consumed by the mysterious flames that water could not quench. It was as if lightning from heaven had struck them, wrote one chronicler. Their ships burned like torches upon the water, and the sea itself seemed to be on fire. The surviving Rus vessels retreated to the Bithynian coast, where they were engaged by additional Byzantine forces led by the general Bardas Phocas. Caught between the imperial navy and land forces, the Rus suffered a catastrophic defeat. Of the original fleet, Byzantine sources claim only a handful of ships escaped to bring news of the disaster back to Kiev. Beyond naval technology, the second pillar of Byzantine defence was intelligence. The empire maintained the most sophisticated information-gathering network in the medieval world, combining diplomatic contacts, merchant informants, and specialised agents to monitor potential threats. By the mid-9th century, this intelligence apparatus had been extended northward to track Rus activities. Byzantine agents established presence in key trading centres along the Dnieper River, particularly at portage points where Rus ships had to be carried overland around rapids. These locations, identified in Constantine Porphyrogenitus's manual De Administrando Imperio, created natural bottlenecks where Rus movements could be observed and information relayed back to Constantinople. The empire also cultivated informants among populations living along Rus travel routes. Pecheneg nomads, traditional enemies of the Rus, were particularly valuable in this regard. Byzantine diplomats provided gifts and trading privileges to Pecheneg chiefs in exchange for prompt notification of Rus fleet movements. This early warning system typically provided Constantinople with several weeks' notice of approaching threats, sufficient time to recall naval forces, strengthen defences, and prepare appropriate responses. Most ingeniously, the Byzantines developed a rapid communication system using fire signals that could transmit messages across hundreds of miles in hours. A chain of hilltop beacons stretched from the empire's frontiers to the capital, with each station maintaining continuous watches. When Rus fleets were spotted entering the Black Sea, this information could reach Constantinople the same day, an extraordinary capability in an age when news typically travelled at the speed of a galloping horse. The third and perhaps most effective Byzantine strategy against the Rus threat was diplomatic. Rather than simply opposing Viking expansion, imperial authorities sought to channel and transform it through a combination of treaties, trade privileges, religious conversion, and ultimately military recruitment. After the failed attack of 860, Byzantine diplomats initiated contact with Rus leaders, offering trading privileges in exchange for peace. The resulting agreements established quotas for Rus merchants in Constantinople, regulated their activities while in Byzantine territory, and created mechanisms for resolving disputes. These commercial ties gave Rus elites a vested interest in maintaining peaceful relations with the empire. Following the devastating defeat of 941, this diplomatic approach intensified. The Treaty of 945 between Igor's successor, Olga, and Emperor Constantine VII formalised relations, with the Rus accepting limitations on their naval activities in the Black Sea and Byzantine territories in the Crimea. Most significantly, Olga herself visited Constantinople in 957 and converted to Christianity, a religious transformation that would ultimately reshape Rus society. The Byzantine diplomatic masterstroke, however, was the transformation of former enemies into elite defenders through the creation of the Varangian Guard. Established by Emperor Basil II in 988 following a military alliance with Vladimir I of Kiev, this unit recruited Norse and Rus warriors to serve as the emperor's personal bodyguard and shock troops. For the Byzantines, the arrangement offered multiple advantages. It provided access to exceptional warriors with a fearsome reputation. It removed potential enemies from their home territories and placed them under direct imperial control. Perhaps most importantly, it leveraged the Norse cultural emphasis on personal loyalty and oath-keeping to create a force fanatically devoted to the emperor, rather than to local Byzantine power structures. For the Varangians themselves, service in Constantinople offered unparalleled opportunities. Guard members received the highest pay in the Byzantine military, enjoyed privileged legal status, and had access to lucrative positions protecting merchant caravans or serving as the emperor's tax collectors. Most attracted warriors from across the Norse world, not just from Rus territories. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia, particularly runestones commemorating men who died in Greece, the Norse term for the Byzantine Empire, confirms that service in the Varangian Guard became a prestigious career for ambitious Vikings throughout the 11th century. The most famous Varangian was Harald Hardrada, future king of Norway, who served in Constantinople from approximately 1034 to 1043. Byzantine sources describe his participation in campaigns from Sicily to the Holy Land, before returning to Scandinavia with wealth that made him the richest man who had ever left Greece. The knowledge, military techniques, and cultural influences these warriors brought back to their homelands would ultimately contribute to the transformation of Viking society itself. The Byzantine experience with Viking aggression offers several crucial insights into successful defensive strategies. First, technological superiority, particularly in naval warfare, could effectively neutralize Viking mobility advantages. Second, sophisticated intelligence networks could eliminate the element of surprise that made Viking raids so devastating elsewhere. Third, and perhaps most significantly, diplomatic engagement could transform potential enemies into valuable allies through a combination of economic incentives, cultural assimilation, and mutual interest. This last lesson would prove particularly relevant in the Western Mediterranean, where another sophisticated civilization was developing its own response to Viking incursions. Like the Byzantines, the Muslim rulers of al-Andalus would demonstrate that cultural and technological sophistication could effectively counter Viking aggression, but they would do so through military innovation rather than diplomatic incorporation. As the surviving Rus limped home from their catastrophic defeat in the waters of the Bosporus, they carried tales of Greek fire that burns on water and ships that breathe flame like dragons. These accounts would join the growing body of evidence suggesting that Viking expansion had reached its limits, that across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, defenders were developing effective countermeasures to the Norse threat. The Vikings who sailed into the Mediterranean seeking new conquests would soon discover another sophisticated civilization ready to meet their challenge, and the lessons learned in these encounters would ultimately contribute to the transformation of Viking society itself. Islamic Andalusia's victory. The Mediterranean Sea had beckoned to Viking adventurers since the early 9th century. Its warm waters promised access to legendary wealth, the gold of North Africa, the silver of Iberia, the luxury goods of the Levant. Most tantalizingly, its shores hosted some of the world's richest cities, centres of commerce and learning that dwarfed anything in northern Europe. By the mid-9th century, Norse raiders had established a pattern of Mediterranean expeditions, typically sailing from bases in Ireland or Normandy, passing through the Strait of Gibraltar, and striking targets along the coasts of modern Spain, Portugal, Morocco, and Algeria. These raids represented the furthest geographic extent of Viking expansion, the southernmost reach of Norse ambition. What these ambitious raiders encountered in the Western Mediterranean was a civilization at the height of its power and sophistication. Islamic, al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled territory covering most of the Iberian Peninsula. Established following the Umayyad conquest of Visigothic Hispania in the early 8th century, al-Andalus by the 9th century had developed into one of the most advanced societies in the medieval world. Its capital, Córdoba, was a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, making it larger than Constantinople and vastly larger than any city in northern Europe. Its streets were paved and lit at night, while Paris and London remained collections of wooden buildings amid muddy tracks. Its libraries contained tens of thousands of volumes, when most European monasteries might house a few dozen manuscripts. Its economy produced fine textiles, sophisticated metalwork, and agricultural innovations that made Andalusian farmland among the most productive in the Mediterranean basin. Most importantly for our story, al-Andalus possessed military capabilities that represented the cutting edge of 9th century warfare. Disciplined cavalry forces, sophisticated siege engines, and naval technologies adapted from Byzantine and North African traditions. When Viking raiders appeared on Andalusian shores, they encountered not divided kingdoms or isolated monasteries, but a unified state with professional military forces and the organisational capacity to respond rapidly to threats. The first major Viking expedition to al-Andalus began in 844 CEE, when a fleet of approximately 80 ships entered the Strait of Gibraltar after raiding along the Atlantic coast of Iberia. Led by chieftains whose names are recorded in Arabic sources as Turges and Osmund, likely Thorgesta and Asmundr in Norse. This force represented a significant investment of Viking resources and manpower. Their initial targets were the wealthy coastal cities of southern Iberia. After unsuccessful attempts against Cadiz and Medina Sidonia, whose defences proved too formidable, the raiders struck at Seville, then the second city of al-Andalus and a major commercial centre on the Guadalquivir River. The attack initially succeeded beyond Viking expectations. Arriving on September 25th, 844, the Norse fleet sailed up the Guadalquivir and caught Seville's defenders unprepared. Contemporary chronicles describe how the raiders fell upon the city like hungry wolves upon sheep, sacking suburbs, burning mosques, and taking hundreds of prisoners for the slave markets. For approximately 1 week, they occupied portions of the city while launching raids into the surrounding countryside. This initial success, however, masked a fundamental miscalculation. Unlike many European targets of Viking aggression, al-Andalus possessed both the military resources and organisational capacity to mount a rapid, coordinated response to the threat. Upon receiving news of the attack, Emir Abd al-Rahman II immediately mobilised the Emirates' standing army. Cavalry units from Cordoba rode hard for Seville, covering the 80 miles in less than 2 days. Simultaneously, governors of neighbouring provinces assembled their forces, creating a converging movement that would trap the Viking raiders between multiple Andalusian armies. Most significantly, the emir ordered his admiral, Ubayd Allah ibn Kulayb, to assemble naval forces to cut off the Vikings' escape route. This last element represented a crucial difference from European responses to Viking raids. While most Christian kingdoms lacked naval capabilities to challenge Norse maritime supremacy, al-Andalus maintained a substantial fleet based primarily at Algeciras and Almeria. The resulting battle for Seville demonstrated how quickly Viking tactical advantages could be neutralised when facing a technologically sophisticated, well-organised opponent. On November 11th, after approximately 6 weeks of occupation, the raiders found themselves simultaneously attacked from multiple directions. Andalusian cavalry, including both light horsemen, armed with composite bows and heavily armoured lancers, engaged Viking forces that had ventured inland. Unlike the predominantly infantry armies of northern Europe, these mounted forces could match Viking mobility, preventing raiders from using their typical hit-and-run tactics. When Viking warriors formed their characteristic shield walls, they faced an enemy that could strike, withdraw, and strike again from different angles, negating the defensive formation's effectiveness. The Northmen stood like a wall of iron, wrote one Arab chronicler, but our horsemen circled them like eagles, striking with arrows and lances, until their lines broke, and they fled toward their ships. Simultaneously, Andalusian naval forces engaged the Viking fleet in the Guadalquivir. Here, technological differences proved decisive. Andalusian warships, influenced by both Byzantine and North African designs, were larger than Viking longships and carried more sophisticated weaponry, including early forms of the mangonel, a torsion catapult that could hurl incendiary projectiles. Most critically, Andalusian naval commanders employed fire ships, vessels deliberately set ablaze and directed into the tightly packed Norse fleet. This tactic, borrowed from Byzantine naval warfare, proved devastatingly effective against wooden longships drawn up along the riverbanks. Ibn al-Qutiyya's chronicle describes how ships of fire were sent among them, and many of their vessels were burned with all the men upon them. The combined land and naval assault shattered Viking cohesion. Those raiders who could reach their remaining ships attempted to flee downriver toward the open sea, only to discover that additional Andalusian forces had established blockades at strategic points along the Guadalquivir. What began as an orderly retreat degenerated into a desperate rout. Arab sources claim that of the original 80 ships, only about 20 escaped the disaster. Viking casualties are variously estimated between 1,000 and 4,000 warriors killed or captured. The prisoners faced grim fates. Some were executed publicly in Cordoba as a demonstration of Andalusian power, while others were sold into slavery, ironically suffering the same destiny they had planned for their Andalusian captives. The most dramatic visual evidence of the victory came when 30 Viking ship prows were removed and mounted on the walls of Seville as trophies, a powerful psychological statement that reversed the terror tactics Vikings typically employed by displaying the heads of slain enemies on their own ships. The defeat at Seville marked a turning point in Viking ambitions in the Mediterranean. It demonstrated that al-Andalus possessed both the military capability and organisational structure to effectively counter Norse raiding tactics. Most importantly, it triggered a systematic Andalusian response that would permanently secure their coasts against future Viking threats. This response centred around three interlocking strategies: coastal fortification, naval adaptation, and intelligence networks. The first element involved a comprehensive programme of coastal defence construction. Abd al-Rahman II ordered the establishment of ribats, fortified monasteries that combined religious functions with military capabilities. At strategic points along the Andalusian coastline, archaeological excavations at sites like Guadamar in Alicante province reveal sophisticated defensive structures dating precisely to this post-raid period, with architecture designed specifically to counter seaborne threats. Simultaneously, existing coastal settlements were fortified with new walls and watchtowers. The distinctive octagonal towers that still dot the Spanish Mediterranean coast largely date from this period of defensive construction. These structures served dual purposes. They provided observation posts to spot approaching raiders and defensive strongpoints where local populations could shelter during attacks. Most importantly, these physical defences were integrated into a comprehensive early warning system. Watchtowers maintained continuous observation of coastal approaches, with riders ready to carry news of approaching threats to provincial governors and ultimately to Cordoba. Contemporary accounts suggest messages could travel from the coast to the capital in less than 24 hours. An impressive communication speed that eliminated the element of surprise crucial to Viking tactics. The second element of the Andalusian response involved naval adaptation. Recognising that controlling coastal waters was essential to preventing Viking incursions, Abd al-Rahman II and his successors invested heavily in expanding the Emirates' fleet. New shipyards were established at Algeciras, Almeria, and Tortosa, producing vessels specifically designed to counter the Viking threat. These Andalusian warships differed significantly from their Norse counterparts. Where Viking longships prioritised speed and shallow draft for raiding operations, Andalusian vessels emphasised firepower and durability. They featured higher freeboards that made them more difficult to board, reinforced rams for engaging enemy ships directly, and platforms for mangonels and other projectile weapons. Most significantly, Andalusian naval architects incorporated elements from multiple maritime traditions. From the Byzantines, they adopted Greek fire technology, though in a less sophisticated form than Constantinople's closely guarded secret. From North African shipbuilders, they incorporated lateen sails that allowed superior manoeuvrability in Mediterranean wind conditions. The resulting hybrid vessels represented the cutting edge of 9th century naval technology. The third element involved intelligence gathering and diplomatic initiatives. Andalusian rulers established informant networks in Christian territories to the north, particularly in the small kingdoms of northern Iberia and in Frankish-controlled Septimania, modern Roussillon and Languedoc. These networks provided early warning of Viking fleet movements, allowing Andalusian forces to prepare for potential raids. Simultaneously, diplomatic outreach to potential Viking targets created mutual defence arrangements. Historical records indicate that Abd al-Rahman II sent embassies to the Byzantine Empire and the Aghlabid rulers of Tunisia following the Seville raid, sharing information about Viking tactics and coordinating defensive measures. This early form of international security cooperation helped ensure that Mediterranean powers presented a united front against Norse incursions. The effectiveness of these combined strategies was demonstrated when Vikings attempted a second major raid on al-Andalus in 859 to 860 CE. This expedition, led by chieftains Björn Ironside and Hastein, was larger and better organised than the 844 attack, comprising approximately 62 ships, according to Christian sources. After raiding along the eastern Spanish coast, attacking Barcelona and the Balearic Islands, the fleet approached Andalusian territories with the apparent intention of repeating the Seville raid. This time, however, they found a fundamentally transformed defensive landscape. Coastal watchtowers spotted the approaching fleet days before it reached Andalusian waters. By the time the Vikings approached Algeciras, Andalusian naval forces were already deployed in strength. The resulting engagement, described in both Arabic and Christian sources, ended in another decisive defeat for the raiders. Ibn Dari's account describes how the Muslims sailed out against them with many ships and burned some of their vessels with naft, a petroleum-based incendiary similar to Greek fire, killing and capturing a great number. The surviving Vikings were forced to withdraw without achieving any significant penetration of Andalusian territory. Frustrated in their primary objective, the expedition continued eastward into the Mediterranean, eventually raiding in southern France, Italy, and North Africa before returning to their bases in the Atlantic. While they achieved some successes against less prepared targets, their failure to penetrate Andalusian defences demonstrated how effectively the emirate had adapted to the Viking threat. The aftermath of these encounters shaped both Andalusian military development and Viking strategy in the Western Mediterranean. For al-Andalus, the experience of countering Norse raids contributed to the development of what historian Hugh Kennedy calls the most sophisticated naval tradition in the Western Mediterranean. The fleet established during this period would later play crucial roles in conflicts with Christian kingdoms to the north and in maintaining Andalusian commercial dominance in the Western Mediterranean. For the Vikings, the lessons were equally significant. The decisive defeats suffered in Andalusian waters demonstrated the limits of their traditional raiding tactics when facing technologically sophisticated, well-organised opponents. While Norse expeditions would continue to enter the Mediterranean throughout the late 9th and 10th centuries, they increasingly avoided Andalusian territories, focusing instead on softer targets in Christian Europe or engaging in legitimate trade rather than raiding. This shift in Viking activity patterns reveals a broader truth about Norse expansion. It was pragmatic rather than ideological. When particular targets proved too costly to attack, Viking leaders redirected their energies elsewhere. The repeated defeats in al-Andalus contributed to a gradual reorientation of Viking activity away from the Mediterranean and toward regions where their tactical advantages remained relevant. Archaeological evidence supports this strategic reassessment. Viking artifacts found in Iberian contexts become significantly rarer after the mid-9th century, suggesting reduced Norse presence in the region. Simultaneously, evidence of Viking activity increases in the British Isles, Francia, and along the Baltic coast, areas where fragmented political structures and limited naval capabilities made raiding more profitable and less dangerous. By the early 10th century, direct Viking threats to al-Andalus had effectively ceased. The combination of formidable defences, naval superiority, and intelligence networks had rendered the emirate, later caliphate, an unattractive target for Norse adventurers. When Vikings did appear in Andalusian waters, it was increasingly as traders rather than raiders, a transformation that paralleled broader changes in Scandinavian society as the Viking Age progressed. The Andalusian experience offers several crucial insights into successful anti-Viking strategies. First, it demonstrates the importance of integrated defence systems that combine physical fortifications, naval forces, and intelligence networks. Second, it highlights how technological advantages, particularly in naval warfare, could effectively neutralise Viking mobility and surprise. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it shows how rapid adaptation and resource mobilisation could transform vulnerable targets into formidable opponents within a single generation. Most importantly, the Andalusian case demonstrates that Viking success or failure was not predetermined by Norse martial prowess or sailing skills, but resulted from the interaction between Viking capabilities and defensive adaptations, where defenders developed effective countermeasures, as in al-Andalus, Byzantium, and among the Wends and Basques, Viking expansion reached its limits and ultimately receded. This pattern would be repeated across Europe as the Viking Age progressed. From the Celtic lands of Ireland, Scotland and Wales to the Frankish territories of Western Europe, communities that initially suffered devastating Norse attacks gradually developed effective defensive systems. The specific forms these systems took varied, widely based on local conditions, resources and traditions, but their emergence marked the beginning of the end for the era of unopposed Viking expansion. As we turn our attention to the Celtic resistance methods that evolved in the British Isles and Brittany, we will see how even regions that initially suffered catastrophic defeats eventually developed strategies that would contribute to the containment and ultimate transformation of the Viking threat. Celtic resistance methods. When the first Viking longships appeared off the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Brittany in the late 8th century, they encountered societies seemingly ill-prepared for the coming storm. The Celtic lands of the western British Isles and northwestern France presented what appeared to be perfect targets for Norse raiders. Wealthy monasteries situated on exposed coastal locations, fragmented political structures with kings and chieftains in constant competition, and limited naval capabilities to counter seaborne threats. The initial impact was catastrophic. Iona, the spiritual heart of Celtic Christianity, was ravaged repeatedly between 795 and 806, with the final attack claiming the lives of 68 monks. Irish monastic settlements at Inishmurray, Inishbofin, and Lambay Island suffered similar fates. In Wales, raids struck Anglesey and the coastal monasteries of Dyfed. Brittany's offshore islands, particularly Noirmoutier with its wealthy monastery of St Philibert, became regular Viking targets and eventually seasonal bases for further raids. The sea spews forth floods of foreigners over Erin, lamented an Irish monk in the Annals of Ulster, so that no haven, no landing place, no stronghold, no fort, no castle might be found, but it was submerged by waves of Vikings and pirates. This initial vulnerability stemmed from several factors unique to Celtic societies. Unlike the centralised kingdoms of Francia or England, Celtic regions maintained traditional, political structures based on numerous small kingdoms and complex client relationships. While this decentralisation offered certain advantages in normal times, it hampered coordinated military responses to external threats. When Vikings struck one kingdom, neighbouring rulers often viewed the situation as an opportunity to settle old scores rather than a common danger requiring unified action. Celtic military traditions also proved initially ill-suited to countering Viking tactics. The warrior elites of Ireland, Scotland and Wales excelled at cattle raiding, hostage-taking, and ritualised combat between champions, all elements of a warfare tradition that emphasised individual prowess and limited bloodshed rather than the annihilation of enemies. Against Vikings who fought in disciplined formations, utilised sophisticated shield wall tactics, and aimed at maximum destruction, these traditional approaches proved inadequate. Perhaps most significantly, Celtic societies lacked the naval traditions of the Basques or Byzantines. While coastal communities maintained fishing boats and trading vessels, they had no equivalent to Viking longships or experience in naval warfare. This maritime disadvantage allowed Norse raiders to strike at will and withdraw before effective resistance could be organised. Yet despite these initial disadvantages, Celtic societies ultimately developed some of the most effective and innovative anti-Viking strategies in Europe. Their responses evolved through three distinct phases: an initial period of disastrous defeats and territorial losses, a middle period of adaptation and learning, and a final phase of effective resistance that in some regions culminated in decisive victory over Norse invaders. The learning period, roughly spanning the years 830 to 900 CE, saw Celtic communities implementing their first systematic countermeasures against Viking raids. These early adaptations focused primarily on reducing vulnerabilities rather than directly confronting Norse military power. The most visible manifestation of this approach was the development of distinctive defensive architecture. Across Ireland, monastic communities began constructing round towers, tall, slender stone structures with elevated doorways accessible only by removable ladders. These towers, typically 70 to 100 feet tall and 50 to 60 feet in circumference at the base, served as both bell towers and refuges during raids. "When the black ships are sighted," wrote one Irish chronicler, "the holy relics and books are carried into the tower, and all the people follow, drawing the ladder after them. Thus they wait out the storm of the heathen's fury." Archaeological investigations confirm the defensive function of these structures. Their elevated entrances, typically 6 to 15 feet above ground level, made them extremely difficult to breach without ladders or siege equipment, neither of which Viking raiders typically carried. Their thick stone walls rendered them virtually impervious to fire, the standard Viking method for dealing with defensive structures. Most importantly, their height provided both observation platforms to spot approaching raiders and secure storage for community valuables. Over 120 round towers were constructed across Ireland during the Viking Age, with the highest concentration in coastal regions and along navigable rivers, precisely the areas most vulnerable to Norse attack. Their effectiveness is attested by their longevity. Many remain standing today, nearly a millennium after the Viking threat receded. Similar architectural adaptations appeared in other Celtic regions. In Wales, coastal churches were reconstructed with thicker walls and fewer windows, often incorporating defensive features like crenellations and arrow loops. In Brittany, entire communities relocated from vulnerable coastal locations to more defensible inland sites, often centred around newly fortified churches. Beyond physical defences, Celtic communities developed sophisticated early warning systems. In Ireland, coastal monasteries established networks of outlying hermitages on prominent headlands, where monks maintained constant watches for approaching sails. Upon spotting Viking ships, these sentinels would light signal fires visible to the main settlement, providing crucial time for the community to secure valuables and seek refuge. In Scotland's Western Isles, archaeological evidence suggests the construction of purpose-built signal stations on prominent coastal features, creating a visual communication network that could transmit warnings across considerable distances. The distribution of these sites indicates careful planning to maximise visibility while minimising the number of stations required. Perhaps most significantly, Celtic societies began adapting their military traditions to counter specific Viking advantages. Traditional Irish and Welsh forces had consisted primarily of lightly armed foot soldiers supported by aristocratic warriors fighting from chariots in earlier periods, or as cavalry. Against Viking shield walls, these forces had proven ineffective. By the mid-9th century, however, Irish and Welsh chronicles describe increasing use of spear phalanxes and close formation infantry tactics clearly influenced by Norse examples. Archaeological evidence supports this tactical evolution. Weapon finds from 9th century Irish contexts show increasing numbers of heavy spears, axes and swords designed for formation fighting, rather than the lighter javelins and slashing weapons traditionally preferred by Celtic warriors. Similarly, grave goods and iconography suggest changes in armour, with more warriors adopting mail shirts and helmets similar to Viking equipment. These adaptations culminated in the emergence of new military elites specifically organised for anti-Viking warfare. In Ireland, the 9th century saw the rise of the Celi de Culdee movement, a monastic reform that, among other changes, emphasised the religious duty of physically defending Christian communities. Monastery-based warrior brotherhoods emerged, combining religious discipline with military training. These groups maintained permanent guards at vulnerable sites and could rapidly mobilise larger forces when Viking fleets were sighted. In Wales, the concept of Tolu, the king's household warriors, evolved from a small elite bodyguard into larger standing military forces maintained specifically to counter Norse threats. These professional warriors, maintained year-round rather than called up only for seasonal campaigns, provided Welsh rulers with rapid response capabilities that could match Viking mobility. The most dramatic example of Celtic adaptation came in the naval sphere. Recognising that controlling coastal waters was essential to countering Viking mobility, Irish and Scottish rulers began developing their own maritime capabilities. By the late 9th century, Irish annals mention fleets maintained by major kingdoms specifically for engaging Viking ships. These Celtic vessels differed from their Norse counterparts, emphasising different tactical priorities. Where Viking longships prioritised speed and oceanworthiness, Celtic craft tended toward broader, more stable platforms optimised for coastal waters and carrying larger fighting contingents. Archaeological evidence from ship burials and harbour sites suggests these vessels incorporated elements of Norse design while maintaining distinctive Celtic features. The effectiveness of these naval adaptations is demonstrated by increasing Irish victories in waterborne engagements. The Annals of Ulster record that in 828, an Irish fleet defeated Vikings off the coast of Wexford, one of the earliest recorded naval victories against Norse raiders. By the late 9th century, such engagements had become common, with Irish forces increasingly taking the offensive against Viking shipping. The culmination of Celtic resistance came in the 10th and early 11th centuries, as adaptive measures evolved into systematic strategies for countering and ultimately defeating Viking power. This final phase is best exemplified by the career of Brian Boru, the Irish king whose methodical campaign against Norse power culminated in the decisive Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Born around 941 CE, Brian rose from minor nobility to become first King of Munster and ultimately High King of Ireland through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and strategic vision. Unlike many Celtic rulers who focused on immediate defence of their own territories, Brian recognised that permanently ending the Viking threat required both military victory and structural reforms to address the vulnerabilities that had initially made Ireland susceptible to Norse attacks. His approach began with systematic reduction of Viking power centres in Ireland. Between 977 and 1000 CE, he led campaigns against the Norse settlements at Limerick, Waterford, and ultimately Dublin, the largest Viking colony in Ireland. Rather than simply raiding these centres, Brian implemented a strategy of permanent occupation, incorporating former Viking territories into his expanding kingdom. Most innovatively, Brian's campaigns featured sophisticated combined arms operations that neutralised traditional Viking advantages. At the Siege of Dublin in 999, he deployed naval forces to blockade the harbour, while land armies encircled the city, preventing both reinforcement and escape. This operation demonstrated how far Irish military capabilities had evolved from the disorganised responses to early Viking raids. Simultaneously, Brian implemented structural reforms that strengthened Irish resistance capabilities. He systematised taxation, creating reliable revenue streams for maintaining standing military forces. He standardised defensive obligations across his territories, ensuring consistent coastal watches and rapid mobilisation procedures. Perhaps most significantly, he invested in infrastructure, roads, bridges and harbours that facilitated rapid movement of defensive forces to threatened areas. The culmination of Brian's anti-Viking strategy came at the Battle of Clontarf on Good Friday, April the 23rd, 1014. This engagement, traditionally viewed as a straightforward conflict between Irish and Viking forces, was in reality a complex political and military event involving both Irish kingdoms and Norse settlements. The opposing force included the Viking settlement of Dublin, allied with the Irish kingdom of Leinster, demonstrating how thoroughly Norse elements had been integrated into Irish political structures by the early 11th century. The battle itself represented a tactical masterpiece that neutralised traditional Viking strengths. Brian's forces prevented the Dublin Vikings from effectively deploying their ships, forcing a land battle on terrain that favoured Irish infantry. When the Viking centre attempted to form its characteristic shield wall, Irish forces executed a complex envelopment manoeuvre, attacking simultaneously from multiple directions to prevent the formation from stabilising. They were like unto two groves of trees on either side of a mountain road, records the 12th century account Cogad Gaedel Re Galaib, the War of the Irish with the foreigners, and the limbs and leaves of the trees were visible through the other. The resulting battle lasted from sunrise to sunset, an unusually protracted engagement for the period that demonstrates the discipline and stamina of both forces. By day's end, the Viking-Leinster alliance had been decisively defeated, with casualties including Sigtryg, the Viking king of Dublin, and numerous Norse commanders, while Brian himself was killed in the aftermath of victory, slain by retreating Vikings, who discovered the elderly king praying in his tent. The battle marked a decisive turning point. Never again would Viking forces pose an existential threat to Irish sovereignty. The Norse settlements in Ireland increasingly integrated into Irish society, maintaining distinct identities but operating within Celtic political structures rather than as independent power centres. Similar patterns of successful resistance emerged in other Celtic regions during this period. In Wales, rulers of Gwynedd and Dyfed developed sophisticated defensive systems combining coastal watchtowers, inland strongholds, and mobile forces that could rapidly respond to Viking landings. By the early 10th century, Norse raids on Welsh territories had decreased significantly, with Vikings increasingly avoiding the well-defended Welsh coast in favour of softer targets elsewhere. In Scotland, the situation evolved differently due to extensive Norse settlement in the Northern and Western Isles. Here, resistance took the form of gradual reassertion of Celtic control through both military pressure and cultural assimilation. By the 12th century, hybrid Norse-Gaelic cultures had emerged in regions like Galloway and the Hebrides, maintaining Viking maritime traditions while increasingly identifying with Celtic political structures. Brittany presents perhaps the most dramatic example of Celtic recovery from initial Viking devastation. After decades of Norse raids that depopulated coastal regions and drove the Breton aristocracy into exile in England and Francia, the late 9th century saw a systematic campaign of reconquest led by Alan Barbatort, Alan Twisted Beard. Between 936 and 939, Alan's forces defeated Viking armies at Nantes and Trans, permanently ending Norse control of Breton territories. The Celtic experience offers several crucial insights into successful anti-Viking strategies. First, it demonstrates the importance of adaptation, the willingness to abandon traditional approaches when they prove ineffective against new threats. Second, it highlights how defensive innovations could neutralise specific Viking advantages. Round towers countered raiders' mobility and fire tactics. Naval development challenged Norse maritime supremacy, and reformed military organisations matched Viking operational tempo. Perhaps most significantly, the Celtic case illustrates the effectiveness of systemic responses that addressed underlying vulnerabilities rather than simply reacting to immediate threats. Brian Boru's success stemmed not just from tactical innovations, but from structural reforms that strengthened Irish society against external pressure. As we turn our attention to the Frankish territories of Western Europe, We will see how these lessons were applied on an even larger scale, as Charlemagne's fragmented inheritance gradually developed into a formidable defensive system that would ultimately contribute to the containment and transformation of the Viking threat. The Celtic peoples, who had once seemed destined to become footnotes in the Viking saga, had instead written their own chapter, one that demonstrated how innovation, adaptation, and resilience could transform even the most vulnerable societies into formidable opponents. As Norse longships pushed deeper into the heart of Europe, they encountered the fractured remnants of what had once been the most powerful empire in the West since Rome's fall. The Frankish territories, stretching across modern France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands and northern Italy, represented the richest prize in continental Europe. Yet in the mid-9th century, these lands seemed uniquely vulnerable to Viking predation. The empire Charlemagne had forged through decades of conquest had splintered after his death in 814 CE. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 formalised this fragmentation, dividing the territory between his grandsons into three kingdoms: West Francia, roughly modern France; East Francia, roughly modern Germany, and a middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea to Italy. This political fracturing created precisely the conditions where Viking raiders thrived. Competing authorities, divided military resources, and limited coordination between neighbouring regions. The initial Frankish responses to Viking incursions proved disastrously inadequate. When a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine to attack Paris in 845, King Charles the Bald of West Francia resorted to the most expedient solution, paying the raiders £7,000 of silver to depart. This massive danegeld, literally Danish gold, temporarily solved the immediate problem, but established a dangerous precedent. Viking leaders quickly recognised that threatening Frankish population centres could be more profitable than actually sacking them. The Franks buy peace with their silver, not their steel, observed one contemporary chronicler. This assessment, while oversimplified, contained a kernel of truth. The fragmented Frankish kingdoms initially lacked both the military organisation and strategic vision to effectively counter Viking mobility and aggression. The consequences were devastating. Throughout the mid-9th century, Viking raids penetrated deep into Frankish territories. Paris was attacked again in 856, 861 and 865. Rouen was sacked in 841. Orleans suffered in 856. Hamburg, the ecclesiastical centre for missionary work in Scandinavia, was ironically destroyed by Danish raiders in 845. Cologne was attacked in 862. No major river system, the Seine, Loire, Garonne, Rhine or Rhône, remained free from Viking incursions. Monastic chronicles from this period paint a picture of societies gripped by existential terror. Ermentarius of Noirmoutier wrote that the number of ships grows larger, the endless flood of Vikings never ceases to increase. The Annals of Saint-Bertin described how the Northmen sailed up the Loire without opposition and reached Tours, where they burned the church of Saint-Martin, once so greatly revered, and many other places. The Annals of Xanten reported simply, "The Northmen inflicted much harm in Frisia and around the Rhine." Yet from these catastrophic failures emerged a systematic Frankish response that would ultimately prove effective. Like the Celtic kingdoms we examined previously, the Frankish territories underwent a learning period during which traditional approaches were abandoned in favour of innovations specifically designed to counter Viking advantages. This adaptive process unfolded across three main areas: fortification strategies, military reorganisation, and the development of specialised counter-Viking forces. The cornerstone of the Frankish defensive adaptation was a revolutionary approach to territorial security centred around fortified bridges and strategic strongpoints. Traditional Frankish defences had focused on protecting specific high-value targets, cities, monasteries and royal residences, while leaving the surrounding countryside vulnerable. This approach proved inadequate against highly mobile Viking raiders who could simply bypass major fortifications to strike softer targets. The new strategy, developed initially under Charles the Bald of West Francia and later adopted throughout the Frankish territories, focused instead on controlling the key access routes that Viking ships required to penetrate inland. Since Norse raiders relied on navigable rivers to project power deep into continental territories, controlling these waterways became the central pillar of Frankish defence. The most visible manifestation of this approach was the construction of fortified bridges across major rivers. These structures served dual purposes. They provided crossing points for Frankish forces, while simultaneously blocking the passage of Viking ships. Typically constructed with stone piers supporting wooden spans, these bridges featured defensive towers at either end and often incorporated chain booms that could be raised to physically block the river. Archaeological investigations at sites like Pont de l'Arche on the Seine reveal sophisticated engineering that combined Roman architectural influences with innovations specific to anti-Viking warfare. The bridges were deliberately constructed at points where rivers narrowed, maximising their effectiveness as blockades while minimising construction challenges. Their defensive towers were designed to accommodate both archers and primitive artillery, torsion-powered weapons that could launch projectiles at ships attempting to force passage. Complementing these fortified bridges was a network of purpose-built strongholds called burhs in Anglo-Saxon territories and castra, or civitates in Frankish lands. These fortifications differed from traditional Frankish defensive works in several key respects. Rather than simply protecting existing settlements, they were strategically positioned to control territory, particularly the approaches to navigable waterways. They featured standardised designs optimised for defence with minimal garrisons. Most importantly, they were developed as systems rather than individual strongpoints, with each fortification positioned to support others within its region. The capitulary royal decree of Pitre, issued by Charles the Bald in 864, formalised this approach, ordering the construction of fortified bridges at Pitre, Auvers and Charenton, all strategic points controlling access to Paris via the Seine. Similar programmes were implemented throughout the Frankish territories, with particularly extensive networks developing along the Loire, Seine and Rhine river systems. This fortification strategy was complemented by a fundamental reorganisation of Frankish military structures. Traditional Frankish armies had consisted primarily of a seasonal levy, the host, supplemented by professional warriors maintained by the king and major nobles. This system, designed for large-scale summer campaigns against fixed objectives, proved ill-suited to countering Viking raids that might come at any season and require rapid response to unpredictable targets. The solution emerged gradually through a series of military reforms that emphasised permanent defensive forces, rapid mobilisation capabilities, and specialised units trained specifically for anti-Viking warfare. The Capitulary of Quierzy, 877, established the framework for this new system, creating standing garrisons for strategic fortifications and formalising the obligations of local authorities to maintain ready forces. Most innovatively, Frankish rulers developed specialised mounted forces capable of responding rapidly to Viking incursions. Traditional Frankish cavalry had consisted of heavily armoured knights whose primary tactical role was shock action, charging with couched lances to break enemy formations. While formidable in set-piece battles, these forces lacked the mobility and flexibility needed to counter Viking hit-and-run tactics. The new Frankish mounted units emphasised different capabilities: rapid movement over long distances, the ability to fight dismounted when necessary, and equipment optimised for the pursuit and engagement of Viking raiding parties. Contemporary accounts describe these troops as riding day and night to intercept Norse raiders and falling upon the Northmen before they could regain their ships. Archaeological evidence supports this tactical evolution. Weapon finds from late 9th century Frankish contexts show increasing numbers of versatile arms suitable for both mounted and dismounted combat. particularly the longsword and the horseman's axe. Simultaneously, changes in stirrup design and saddle construction improved riders' stability, allowing more effective combat from horseback against infantry opponents. These combined adaptations, strategic fortifications and mobile response forces, reached their fullest expression during the Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 CE. This engagement, perhaps the most thoroughly documented Viking operation of the entire era, demonstrates how effectively the Frankish defences had evolved since the disasters of mid-century. The Viking force that appeared before Paris in November 885 was unprecedented in scale. Contemporary sources claim between 700 and 900 ships carrying as many as 40,000 warriors. While these numbers are certainly exaggerated, archaeological and textual evidence suggests this was indeed the largest Norse expedition yet mounted against the Frankish territories. Led by the Danish king Sigfrid and several other chieftains, the fleet had already sacked Rouen and other settlements along the lower Seine before reaching Paris. Their objective was clear: to capture or extract payment from the city, then proceed upriver to raid Burgundy. In previous decades, such a force would likely have succeeded with minimal opposition. But the Paris that confronted them in 885 was fundamentally transformed from the vulnerable target of earlier raids. Under Count Odo, later King Odo, and Bishop Goslin, Paris had implemented the full spectrum of Frankish defensive innovations. Two fortified bridges, the Grand Pont and the Petit Pont, blocked Viking access to the upper Seine. The Ile de la Cité, the island heart of Paris, had been transformed into a formidable fortress with stone walls and defensive towers. Most importantly, the city maintained a permanent garrison of professional soldiers specifically trained and equipped for anti-Viking warfare. When the Norse fleet arrived and demanded passage upriver, offering to spare Paris itself in exchange, they received an unequivocal refusal. What followed was a siege of exceptional length and intensity for the period, lasting from November 885 to October 886, nearly a full year. Throughout this protracted engagement, the Frankish defences demonstrated their effectiveness. Multiple Viking attempts to force the bridges failed against determined resistance. When Norse engineers attempted to undermine the Grand Pont's central tower, Frankish defenders countered with boiling oil and pitch poured through murder holes, architectural features specifically designed for this purpose. When Vikings employed siege engines against the city walls, the defenders responded with their own artillery, using catapults and mangonels to target Norse concentrations. Most significantly, the strategic system of fortifications and mobile forces functioned as designed. Though isolated, Paris was not alone. Messengers slipped through the Viking lines to summon assistance from other Frankish territories. In February, a relief force led by Count Henry of Saxony briefly broke the siege before withdrawing. The final relief came in October when Emperor Charles the Fat arrived with the main Frankish army. The outcome proved politically complex. Charles ultimately paid the Vikings to lift the siege and permitted them passage upriver to raid Burgundy, which had opposed his rule, decisions that contributed to his subsequent deposition. Yet from a military perspective, the defence of Paris represented a remarkable achievement. The city had withstood the largest Viking force yet assembled in Western Europe for nearly a year, inflicting significant casualties and demonstrating the effectiveness of the new Frankish defensive system. Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who witnessed the siege firsthand and later wrote an account in verse, captured the significance of the defence. Paris, though small in size, stood firm in the face of 1,000 ships, never fearing the fury of the Northmen, nor submitting to their demands. The successful defence of Paris marked a turning point in Frankish-Viking relations. While Norse raids would continue for several more decades, their nature fundamentally changed. Large-scale operations against major Frankish population centres became increasingly rare as Vikings recognised the diminishing returns of attacking well-defended targets. Instead, Norse activity shifted toward permanent settlement in specific regions, particularly Normandy, and political involvement in Frankish internal conflicts. This evolution reflected a broader pattern emerging across Europe. As potential targets developed effective countermeasures, Viking strategy adapted toward paths of lesser resistance, whether geographical, shifting to less well-defended regions, or methodological, transitioning from raiding to settlement and political engagement. The Frankish experience offers several crucial insights into successful anti-Viking strategies. First, it demonstrates the effectiveness of systems thinking, addressing Viking mobility advantages through integrated networks of fortifications rather than isolated strongpoints. Second, it highlights the importance of specialised forces trained and equipped specifically for counter-Viking operations. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it shows how defensive innovations could force fundamental changes in Viking behaviour, ultimately contributing to the transformation of Norse society itself. This last point deserves particular emphasis. The gradual containment of Viking raiding opportunities through improved defences across Europe created increasing pressure for Scandinavian societies to develop alternative economic and political models. The establishment of the Duchy of Normandy in 911, when the Viking leader Rollo accepted lands from the Frankish king Charles the Simple in exchange for defending the region against other raiders, exemplifies this transformation from predation to integration. As we turn our attention to the Slavic territories of Eastern Europe, we will see how these patterns of adaptation, containment and integration played out in yet another cultural context, one where Vikings would ultimately become the defenders against their own kind. The Frankish territories that had once seemed destined to become permanent Viking hunting grounds had instead become the proving grounds for defensive innovations that would help bring the Viking Age to a close. And far to the east, among the forests and rivers of the Slavic interior, another chapter in this story of resistance was unfolding. Slavic interior defences. While Viking raiders were battering the gates of Paris and probing the defences of Constantinople, another Norse expansion was unfolding in the densely forested interior of Eastern Europe. Here, along the great river systems that would eventually become the heartland of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, Scandinavian adventurers encountered Slavic tribes whose defensive adaptations would contribute significantly to the ultimate transformation of Viking society. The Eastern Viking expansion differed fundamentally from the Western raids that have dominated our narrative thus far. Where Western Vikings primarily engaged in hit-and-run coastal raids before eventually establishing settlements, Eastern expansion began as a trading enterprise that gradually evolved into political domination of key routes and centres. The geography of Eastern Europe shaped this distinctive pattern. The region offered no wealthy coastal monasteries or cities for lightning raids. Instead, its value lay in access to trade routes connecting northern Europe to the Byzantine Empire and Islamic Caliphate. The Volga River provided a pathway to the Caspian Sea and lucrative markets in Baghdad and Samarkand. The Dnieper offered access to the Black Sea and Constantinople. Controlling these waterways meant controlling the flow of silver, silk, spices and slaves between north and south. For Scandinavian merchants and adventurers, these opportunities proved irresistible. Archaeological evidence from sites like Staraya Ladoga shows Norse presence in northwestern Russia by the mid-8th century, even before the traditional start of the Viking Age in the west. By the 9th century, Scandinavians had established a presence at key points throughout the region: Novgorod near Lake Ilmen, Kiev on the middle Dnieper, and numerous smaller outposts along the major river systems. The indigenous population these Norse traders and warriors encountered consisted primarily of Eastern Slavic tribes, the ancestors of modern Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, along with Finnic peoples in the north and various steppe nomads to the south. These groups initially lacked the centralised political structures and military capabilities of the Byzantine Empire or Frankish kingdoms. Yet they possessed advantages that would prove crucial in their interactions with Viking expansionism. intimate knowledge of challenging terrain, distinctive military traditions adapted to forest warfare, and cultural flexibility that allowed rapid adoption of useful foreign elements. The initial Slavic response to Norse incursions appears to have been accommodation rather than direct resistance. The primary chronicle, a Kievan Rus's text compiled in the early 12th century, describes how Slavic tribes initially paid tribute to Viking, Varangian rulers in the mid-9th century before expelling them, falling into internal conflict, and then paradoxically inviting a new group of Scandinavian rulers led by Rurik to restore order. While this account contains obvious mythological elements designed to legitimise the Rurikid dynasty that ruled Kievan Rus, archaeological evidence confirms a pattern of initial Norse dominance followed by gradual Slavic reassertion and eventual cultural synthesis. This process unfolded differently than the direct military confrontations we've examined elsewhere, yet it ultimately proved equally effective at transforming Viking ambitions and methods. The first element of effective Slavic response involved geographical adaptation, using the challenging terrain of Eastern Europe to neutralise traditional Viking advantages. Where Norse raiders had exploited the mobility advantages of their longships in Western Europe, the Eastern European landscape imposed significant constraints on this mobility. The great rivers that served as highways into the interior, the Volga, Dnieper, Don and their tributaries, featured natural obstacles that complicated navigation. The Dnieper Rapids, a series of 7 major cataracts south of modern Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, forced Viking crews to portage their vessels overland, sometimes for considerable distances. During these portages, heavily laden with trade goods and separated from the safety of their ships, Norse parties became vulnerable to ambush. Slavic defenders exploited these vulnerabilities with sophisticated ambush tactics. The primary chronicle describes how the Drevlians, an Eastern Slavic tribe, would monitor predictable portage routes and attack Norse trading parties at their most vulnerable points. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts, with weapon finds and battle debris concentrated around portage sites and river narrows where ships would be forced to navigate slowly. Beyond these geographical constraints, the dense forests covering much of Eastern Europe neutralised another traditional Viking advantage: their skill in open-field battle formations. Norse tactics centred around the shield wall, a tightly packed formation of overlapping shields that presented a nearly impenetrable barrier to frontal assault. This formation proved devastatingly effective on the open beaches and fields of Western Europe, but became unwieldy or impossible in the thick forests of the east. Slavic warriors adapted their tactics to exploit this vulnerability. Rather than meeting Viking parties in direct confrontation, they developed sophisticated forest warfare techniques, emphasising ambush, harassment, and targeted strikes against isolated elements. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus, writing in the mid-10th century, described how Slavic tribes would track Norse trading expeditions along the Dnieper, waiting for moments of vulnerability before attacking from the shelter of the trees, as is their custom. Archaeological evidence reveals the specialised equipment developed for this forest warfare. Slavic weapons from this period show an emphasis on versatility and close-quarter effectiveness. Short spears that could be used in confined spaces, axes that doubled as tools for moving through dense vegetation, and distinctive curved knives optimised for surprise attacks. Body armour was typically lighter than Viking equipment, prioritising mobility over maximum protection. Most innovatively, Slavic defenders developed a distinctive form of fortification perfectly adapted to forest environments. These settlements, called gorodishchi, plural, gorodishcha, combined natural and artificial defences in a unique synthesis. Typically situated on promontories or hills surrounded by rivers or ravines on multiple sides, they featured wooden palisades reinforced with earthen ramparts, often arranged in concentric rings. Unlike the stone castles of Western Europe, these wooden fortifications could be rapidly constructed, easily repaired, and seamlessly integrated into the forest environment. Archaeological excavations at sites like Novgorod, Gnezdovo, and Staraya Ladoga reveal how these fortifications evolved specifically to counter threats from riverborne raiders. Early examples from the 8th to 9th centuries typically featured single ramparts and relatively simple layouts. By the 10th century, they had developed into sophisticated defensive systems with multiple barriers, complex gate arrangements designed to trap attackers in killing zones, and carefully planned fields of fire for defenders using bows and javelins. The effectiveness of these combined defensive adaptations, geographical knowledge, forest warfare tactics, and specialised fortifications, is demonstrated by the changing pattern of Scandinavian activity in the region. By the late 9th century, Norse adventurers had largely abandoned attempts to dominate the region through military force alone, instead pursuing influence through trade partnerships, marriage alliances, and gradual cultural integration. This integration process produced one of the most remarkable developments in the entire Viking story: the transformation of Norse adventurers from external raiders into the ruling elite of a new Slavic-Scandinavian hybrid culture. The Rurikid dynasty that established itself at Novgorod, and later Kiev, maintained Norse military traditions and trading connections, while progressively adopting Slavic language, religious practices, and political structures. By the mid-10th century, this cultural synthesis had produced a new power in Eastern Europe, Kievan Rus, a federation of East Slavic and Finnic peoples under Scandinavian-descended leadership. The very name Rus likely derives from Rotsi, the Finnish term for the Svea people of central Sweden, indicating the Norse origins of the ruling elite. Yet within a few generations, these rulers had become thoroughly Slavicized, adopting local names, the Slavic language, and eventually Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This transformation created a fascinating historical irony: Vikings who had become defenders against Vikings. As Kievan Rus has consolidated its power along the Dnieper trade route, its rulers found themselves defending against new waves of Scandinavian adventurers seeking the same opportunities they had once pursued. The primary chronicle describes how Prince Vladimir of Kiev, himself of Viking descent but thoroughly Slavicized, defended against Varangians from beyond the sea, who threatened Novgorod in the late 10th century. The culmination of this defensive evolution came in the Battle of Dorostopol, 971 CE, where the forces of Kievan Russes under Sviatoslav I faced a Byzantine army that included a substantial Varangian contingent. This engagement represents a remarkable historical moment: Slavicized Vikings fighting against newly arrived Scandinavians in Byzantine service. Sviatoslav himself embodied this cultural transformation. Though descended from the Norse Rurikid dynasty, his grandfather was Rurik himself according to tradition, he bore a Slavic name, worshipped Slavic deities, and led a predominantly Slavic army. Yet contemporary accounts describe him maintaining certain Norse traditions, wearing his hair in a distinctive Viking style with a single lock at the side of his head, and leading from the front in battle with berserker-like ferocity. The Battle of Dorostopol resulted in defeat for Sviatoslav's forces, but it demonstrated how thoroughly the defensive adaptations of Eastern Europe had transformed Viking expansion in the region. Rather than remaining external raiders, Scandinavians had become integrated into local power structures, adopting Slavic defensive methods while contributing their own military traditions to create a syncretic culture that was neither purely Norse nor purely Slavic. Archaeological evidence strongly supports this pattern of cultural synthesis. Excavations at urban centres like Kiev, Chernigov, and Gnezdovo reveal material culture that combines Scandinavian and Slavic elements in increasingly integrated ways throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. Early layers typically show distinct Norse and Slavic artifacts in separate contexts. Later layers show hybrid forms incorporating elements from both traditions. This pattern is particularly evident in defensive structures and military equipment. Fortifications from the 10th to 11th centuries show Scandinavian influences in gate designs and defensive techniques alongside traditional Slavic construction methods. Weapons increasingly combined elements from both traditions. Swords with Norse-style blades but Slavic decorative elements. Axes that merged Scandinavian battle designs with Slavic forestry tools. The transformation of Viking ambitions in Eastern Europe offers crucial insights into the broader pattern of Norse expansion and its limits. Unlike in Western Europe, where raiders encountered sophisticated kingdoms with Roman-influenced military traditions, or in the Mediterranean, where they faced technologically superior opponents. In the Slavic territories of Vikings encountered societies that initially appeared less developed militarily, but possessed advantages perfectly suited to their specific environment. The Slavic success in absorbing and transforming Viking expansion demonstrates that effective resistance did not always require technological superiority or overwhelming military force. By exploiting geographical advantages, adapting traditional practices to counter specific threats, and selectively incorporating useful elements from the invader's culture, Slavic societies effectively channeled Norse energy from external raiding into internal development. This pattern of cultural absorption would ultimately contribute to the end of the Viking Age itself. As opportunities for traditional raiding declined due to improved defences across Europe, Scandinavian societies increasingly redirected their energies toward trade, settlement, and political consolidation. The warrior ethos that had driven the initial explosion of Viking activity gradually transformed into the political and commercial leadership that would characterise medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to enhance our understanding of this transformative process. Excavations at Gnezdovo near Smolensk have revealed a major centre where Scandinavian and Slavic elements coexisted and gradually merged during the 9th to 10th centuries. DNA analysis of burials shows individuals of both Norse and Slavic ancestry, often with material goods reflecting both cultural traditions. Similar findings at sites throughout the region confirm that cultural integration, rather than simple conquest or resistance, characterised the Eastern European response to Viking expansion. The Slavic experience represents the final major example in our global survey of successful responses to Viking aggression. From the Wends of the Baltic to the Muslims of al-Andalus, from the Byzantines to the Franks, from the Celts to the Eastern Slavs, we have traced a remarkable pattern of adaptation and innovation that collectively transformed the Viking Age from a period of unopposed Norse expansion to one of increasing containment and ultimately transformation. As we draw these threads together, a coherent picture emerges of how the Viking Age reached its limits and eventually came to a close, not through any single decisive defeat, but through the cumulative effect of defensive innovations across 3 continents that gradually closed the opportunity space for traditional Viking activities and forced fundamental changes in Scandinavian society itself. Common threads of success. As we've journeyed across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Near East, examining the diverse societies that successfully countered Viking aggression, distinct patterns have emerged. Despite their cultural, geographical, and technological differences, these successful defenders implemented strikingly similar strategic principles. By analysing these common threads, we can identify a framework that explains not just how individual communities survived, but how the Viking Age itself eventually came to an end. The first and perhaps most fundamental pattern involves the neutralisation of Viking mobility advantages. From the earliest raids on Lindisfarne to the height of Norse expansion, the longship had served as the cornerstone of Viking power projection. Its unique combination of ocean-worthiness and shallow draft allowed Norse raiders to strike anywhere with coastal or riverine access, then vanish before effective resistance could be organised. Successful defenders systematically targeted this advantage through multiple approaches. The Wends developed shallow draft vessels that could outmaneuver Viking ships in coastal lagoons and river estuaries. The Basques created sophisticated coastal warning systems that eliminated the element of surprise. The Byzantines deployed Greek fire and specialised warships that could engage and destroy Norse vessels before they reached their targets. The Franks constructed fortified bridges and strategic strongpoints that controlled river access to vulnerable interior regions. What these diverse approaches share is a recognition that Viking naval mobility represented both their greatest strength and a potential vulnerability. By controlling waterways, developing specialised naval forces, or creating early warning systems, defenders transformed the maritime environment from a highway for Norse expansion into a contested zone where raiders faced increasing risks and diminishing returns. Archaeological evidence confirms the effectiveness of these counter-mobility strategies. Ship burials and underwater archaeology from the late Viking Age show increasing Norse investment in larger, more heavily built vessels designed for naval combat rather than raiding, a direct response to the improving maritime defences they encountered. The famous Skuldelev ships from Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, deliberately scuttled around 1070 CE, include specialised warships with higher freeboards and reinforced hulls that would have been unnecessary in the early Viking Age when raiders faced minimal naval opposition. The second common pattern involves technological counters to specific Viking advantages. Across Europe and beyond, defenders developed specialised weapons, fortifications, and tactical systems designed explicitly to neutralise Norse military capabilities. The Andalusian Muslims adapted Byzantine incendiary weapons to counter Viking ships in riverine engagements. The Basques deployed crossbows, whose armour-penetrating capabilities neutralised the protection of Norse mail and shields. The Irish developed round towers impervious to the fire tactics that Vikings typically used against wooden structures. The Eastern Slavs created fortification systems perfectly adapted to forest environments where traditional Norse formation fighting became ineffective. What unites these diverse innovations is their specificity. They were not general military improvements, but targeted solutions to particular Viking advantages. This pattern of specific technological counters demonstrates how seriously medieval societies took the Norse threat, and how willing they were to innovate when traditional methods proved inadequate. Material culture from the period provides tangible evidence of this technological arms race. Weapon finds from 9th to 10th century contexts show increasing specialisation, with designs optimised for particular tactical situations rather than general purpose use. Fortifications show architectural features specifically designed to counter Viking attack methods. From the elevated doorways of Irish round towers to the reinforced river-facing walls of Frankish strongpoints. The third common thread involves intelligence networks and early warning systems. Perhaps the most devastating element of early Viking raids was their unpredictability, the ability of Norse ships to appear without warning before local defenders could organise effective resistance. Successful defensive strategies systematically eliminated this advantage through sophisticated information gathering and communication systems. The Byzantine Empire maintained an elaborate intelligence network that tracked Rus movements along Eastern European river systems, providing Constantinople with weeks of advance notice before potential attacks. The Andalusian Caliphate established coastal watchtowers and rapid messenger systems that could alert inland forces to approaching Viking fleets. The Basques created a system of signal fires that could transmit warnings along their entire coastline within hours. The Franks developed specialised mounted forces that could rapidly respond to raids anywhere within their territories. These systems shared a common purpose, transforming Viking raids from unpredictable catastrophes into anticipated challenges for which defenders could prepare. By eliminating the element of surprise, they forced Norse leaders to commit larger forces to achieve meaningful results, raising the cost of raiding and reducing its profitability. Archaeological evidence of these warning systems remains visible in landscapes across Europe. The distinctive coastal watchtowers of Andalusia, the hilltop signal stations of Ireland, the fortified bridges of Francia, all stand as testament to the sophisticated defensive networks developed to counter Viking mobility and surprise. The fourth pattern involves psychological warfare, countering the terror tactics that had made early Viking raids so devastatingly effective. Norse raiders had deliberately cultivated an aura of invincibility through distinctive appearance, ritualized violence and targeted destruction of symbols of authority. Successful defenders systematically undermined this psychological advantage. The Byzantines staged elaborate displays of technological superiority, using Greek fire demonstrations to demoralize potential attackers. The Andalusians mounted Viking ship prows on the walls of Seville, transforming symbols of Norse power into trophies demonstrating their defeat. Brian Boru of Ireland conducted ceremonial circuits of Viking settlements, physically demonstrating his authority over formerly independent Norse colonies. These psychological countermeasures served a crucial purpose. They broke the mystique of Viking invincibility that had paralysed many early defenders. By demonstrating that Norse raiders could be defeated, often decisively, they inspired more effective resistance and undermined the terror advantage that had made early Viking raids so disproportionately successful. Contemporary accounts confirm the psychological impact of these demonstrations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, recording Alfred the Great's victories against Danish forces in England, notes how the spirit of the people was lifted by seeing Viking captives and captured banners. Ibn al-Qutiyya describes how Andalusian victories against Norse raiders gave heart to the people and showed that the Northmen could bleed like other men. The fifth common thread involves economic warfare, denying Vikings profitable targets or making raiding prohibitively expensive. Successful defenders recognized that Norse expansion was fundamentally economic in nature, driven by the opportunity to acquire wealth through raiding, trading, or extortion. By systematically reducing these opportunities, they altered the cost-benefit calculation that drove Viking activity. The Irish relocated valuable church treasures to inland locations or purpose-built round towers, removing the most attractive targets from Viking reach. The Franks developed a system of fortified market towns where commerce could continue under protection, denying raiders access to concentrated wealth. The Byzantines channeled Norse economic ambitions into regulated trade and military service, transforming potential raiders into commercial partners and mercenary forces. These economic countermeasures struck at the very heart of Viking motivation. By reducing the profitability of raiding, while simultaneously offering alternative economic opportunities through trade or service, they gradually transformed Norse activity from predation to participation in broader European economic systems. Archaeological evidence strongly supports this economic transformation. Hoards and grave goods from the early Viking Age typically contain looted items, church plate, monastic metalwork, and other clearly plundered wealth. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, Norse wealth increasingly derived from trade, with Arabic coins, Byzantine silks, and other commercial goods replacing looted treasures in the archaeological record. Perhaps the most significant common thread across successful anti-Viking strategies was their systemic nature. Rather than focusing on winning individual battles or protecting specific targets, the most effective defensive systems addressed the underlying conditions that made Viking raiding possible and profitable. They combined physical defences, organisational innovations, technological adaptations, and economic alternatives into integrated systems that collectively transformed the strategic landscape. The Frankish defensive system under Charles the Bald didn't just protect individual cities, but controlled entire river systems through strategically placed fortifications and mobile response forces. Brian Boru's Irish strategy didn't just win battles against Viking settlements, but restructured Irish society to eliminate the political fragmentation that had made it vulnerable. The Byzantine approach didn't just defeat Rus raiders militarily, but incorporated them into imperial structures as traders and soldiers. This systems thinking represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of medieval responses to Viking aggression. It recognised that effective defence required more than tactical victory. It demanded strategic transformation of the environment in which Viking activity occurred. The cumulative effect of these defensive adaptations across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Near East was to gradually close the opportunity space for traditional Viking activities. As potential targets developed effective countermeasures, Norse leaders faced increasingly unattractive options. They could attack better defended targets with diminishing returns, seek new victims in more distant regions at greater cost, or adapt their own societies toward more sustainable economic and political models. Increasingly, they chose the latter path. The late 10th and 11th centuries saw a fundamental transformation of Scandinavian society from a raid-based economy toward more conventional medieval structures centred around agriculture, trade, and territorial rule. The conversion to Christianity, the consolidation of royal power, the development of urban centres, and the integration into European political systems all reflected this broader adaptation to a world where traditional Viking activities no longer offered viable paths to wealth and power. This transformation wasn't imposed from outside through decisive military defeat. Rather, it emerged organically as Scandinavian societies responded to the changing strategic environment created by successful defensive adaptations across their former raiding territories. The end of the Viking Age came not through the destruction of Norse culture, but through its evolution into forms compatible with the broader European world it had once preyed upon. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to enhance our understanding of this transformative process. Excavations at urban centres like Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang reveal how Scandinavian settlements evolved from seasonal trading posts into permanent towns with diverse economic activities. Analysis of shipbuilding techniques shows how Norse vessel design shifted from the raid-optimised longship towards specialised craft for trade, fishing, and naval warfare. Studies of administrative structures document the emergence of more centralised political authority capable of controlling and directing Norse military power. The collective story of successful resistance to Viking expansion offers insights that transcend its specific historical context. It demonstrates how societies under existential threat can adapt and innovate, developing effective countermeasures to seemingly overwhelming advantages. It shows how technological and organisational evolution can transform strategic relationships, gradually shifting the balance of power between attackers and defenders. Perhaps most significantly, it illustrates how systemic responses to security challenges can produce more fundamental and lasting solutions than reactive measures focused on immediate threats. As we prepare to conclude our exploration of the tribes and kingdoms that successfully defeated Viking raiders, we can appreciate the remarkable adaptive capacity of medieval societies often dismissed as primitive or stagnant. From the Wends of the Baltic to the Muslims of al-Andalus, from the Byzantines to the Franks, from the Celts to the Eastern Slavs, all demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking, technological innovation, and organisational flexibility that would be impressive in any era. Their collective achievement was not merely surviving the Viking onslaught, but transforming it, channeling Norse energy from destructive raiding toward constructive participation in medieval European civilization. The end of the Viking Age represents not the defeat of Scandinavian culture, but its evolution into forms that would contribute significantly to European development for centuries to come. In our final section, we will examine how internal transformations within Scandinavian society itself complemented these external pressures, collectively bringing the Viking Age to a close, not with a catastrophic collapse, but with a gradual transition into the medieval world order. Conclusion: the end of an era. The monastery bells of Lindisfarne that rang in terror on that June morning in 793 CE would, 2.5 centuries later, ring out across a fundamentally transformed northern world. The Viking Age that began with such shocking violence ended not with a decisive battle or catastrophic defeat, but through a complex process of internal transformation and external adaptation that gradually closed the chapter on one of history's most dramatic periods of expansion. By the late 11th century, the Norse world had undergone profound changes that collectively rendered traditional Viking activities obsolete. These transformations emerged from both internal developments within Scandinavian society and external pressures created by the defensive adaptations we've explored throughout this narrative. Perhaps the most significant internal transformation was the consolidation of royal power across Scandinavia. The early Viking Age had been characterised by fragmented political authority, numerous petty kingdoms and chieftainships competing for limited resources. This fragmentation had created both the pressure for external raiding, as ambitious men sought wealth and fame abroad, and the opportunity for it, as no central authority could effectively control or direct Norse military power. By the 11th century, this political landscape had fundamentally changed. In Denmark, the dynasty established by Gorm the Old and his son, Harald Bluetooth, had created a unified kingdom with effective control over its territory and military resources. In Norway, first Harald Fairhair and later Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, established centralised authority capable of directing Norse martial energy towards state objectives rather than private raiding. In Sweden, the consolidation came somewhat later, but followed a similar pattern under kings like Olof Skotkonung. Archaeological evidence confirms this political transformation. Royal centres like Jelling in Denmark, with its massive runestones and burial mounds, demonstrate the increasing power and prestige of centralised authority. Administrative structures became more sophisticated, with networks of royal estates, standardised weights and measures, and eventually minted coinage, replacing the ad hoc arrangements of the early Viking period. This political consolidation had profound implications for Viking activity. Kings seeking to establish legitimate authority had strong incentives to control the military power of their subjects, directing it towards state objectives, like territorial warfare against neighbouring kingdoms, rather than allowing the private raiding expeditions that had characterised the early Viking Age. Royal authority increasingly monopolised the legitimate use of violence, a fundamental characteristic of medieval state formation that directly contradicted the entrepreneurial warfare of traditional Viking raiding. Complementing this political transformation was the Christianisation of Scandinavia, a process that both reflected and reinforced the changing nature of Norse society. The conversion of Scandinavia occurred unevenly between the late 10th and early 12th centuries, with Denmark largely Christianised under Harald Bluetooth, who proudly proclaimed on the Jelling stone that he made the Danes Christian. Norway under Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, and Sweden somewhat later under kings like Inge the Elder. While often portrayed primarily as a religious change, Christianisation had profound implications for the social and political structures that had supported Viking raiding. The Christian Church provided ideological support for centralised kingship, promoting the concept of divinely sanctioned royal authority against traditional Norse ideas of negotiated leadership and personal autonomy. Christian ethical frameworks, while certainly not pacifistic, condemned the kind of indiscriminate violence against civilian populations that had characterised Viking raids on Christian communities. Most practically, integration into the broader Christian world of medieval Europe opened alternative pathways to wealth, status and power that didn't require raiding. Trade networks expanded as Scandinavian merchants gained access to Christian markets. Diplomatic relationships developed as Norse rulers joined the community of Christian kings. Cultural exchange accelerated as Scandinavians adopted European administrative techniques, architectural styles, and literary traditions. Material culture from this period vividly illustrates this transformation. Church construction boomed across Scandinavia in the 11th and 12th centuries, with over 1,000 stone churches built in Denmark alone during this period. Runestones increasingly featured Christian imagery alongside traditional Norse designs. Burial practices shifted from cremation or ship burial to Christian inhumation, often in churchyards that physically centred communities around the new faith. The third major internal transformation involved economic diversification and urbanisation. Early Viking society had been predominantly rural, with wealth concentrated in land ownership, livestock, and portable valuables, often acquired through raiding. By the 11th century, a more complex economic landscape had emerged, with growing urban centres, specialised craft production, and extensive trade networks creating alternative paths to prosperity. Towns like Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang and Ribe evolved from seasonal trading posts into permanent settlements with diverse economic functions. Archaeological excavations reveal increasingly specialised craft production, jewellery making, blacksmithing, textile production, and other skilled trades that created value through manufacturing rather than extraction or plunder. Trade expanded dramatically, with Scandinavian merchants active from the North Atlantic to the Caspian Sea, exchanging northern products like furs, amber, and walrus ivory for silver, silk, wine, and other luxury goods. This economic transformation reduced both the pressure for raiding by creating alternative sources of wealth and its relative attractiveness, as the risks of attacking increasingly well-defended targets outweighed potential rewards. Young men seeking fortune and status could now find opportunities in trade, craft production, or service to increasingly powerful kings rather than hazardous raiding expeditions against hardening targets. Evidence for this economic shift appears throughout the archaeological record. Coin hoards from the 11th century show increasing monetization of the Scandinavian economy, with regular use of silver currency replacing the hacksilver and weight-based transactions of the early Viking period. Urban excavations reveal growing craft specialization, with dedicated workshops and industrial areas replacing the generalized production of earlier settlements. Harbour facilities expanded to accommodate growing trade, with sophisticated docking structures and warehouses appearing at major ports. These internal transformations intersected with the external pressures created by improving defences across Viking targets. As we've documented throughout this narrative, potential victims had developed increasingly effective countermeasures to Norse raiding tactics. From the Wends of the Baltic to the Muslims of al-Andalus, from the Byzantines to the Franks, from the Celts to the Eastern Slavs, all had implemented defensive systems that raised the costs and reduced the benefits of traditional Viking activities. The cumulative effect was to gradually close the opportunity space for raiding, while simultaneously opening alternative pathways for Scandinavian energy and ambition. This process didn't occur overnight or uniformly across the Norse world. Different regions transformed at different rates, with some areas maintaining traditional Viking activities longer than others. The general trajectory, however, was clear. By the mid-11th century, the classic Viking raid had become increasingly rare, replaced by more conventional medieval warfare, trade, and political engagement. The final Viking expeditions demonstrate this transformation. When Harald Hardrada, himself a former member of the Byzantine Varangian Guard, launched his invasion of England in 1066, he did so not as a raid leader seeking plunder, but as a king asserting a disputed claim to the English throne. His defeat and death at Stamford Bridge traditionally marks the end of the Viking Age, yet it bears little resemblance to the lightning raids that had begun that age nearly 3 centuries earlier. Similarly, the Norman conquest of England that same year, led by descendants of Viking settlers in Normandy, represented not a continuation of Viking raiding, but its transformation into conventional medieval warfare. William the Conqueror claimed the English throne through feudal inheritance law, brought a professional army of knights and infantry rather than raid-oriented warriors, and established a Norman aristocracy integrated into European feudal structures rather than a Norse raiding base. These final Viking activities demonstrate how thoroughly Norse martial energy had been channeled into conventional medieval forms. The warriors who had once terrorised Europe as raiders outside its political and cultural systems had become participants within those systems, still formidable, still influential, but operating according to shared rules and expectations rather than as external predators. Archaeological evidence from late Viking Age Scandinavia confirms this transformation. Weapons and armour increasingly conformed to European standards rather than distinctive Norse types. Ship design evolved towards specialised vessels for different functions: dedicated warships, trading vessels, fishing boats rather than the multi-purpose longship optimized for raiding. Fortifications and defensive structures proliferated as Scandinavian societies adopted the territorial defence concerns of conventional medieval kingdoms rather than the offensive orientation of raiding cultures. The legacy of this transformation extends far beyond the conventional end date of the Viking Age. Norse influence remained profound across much of Europe, from the Norman kingdoms of England and Sicily to the Rus territories of Eastern Europe. Viking descendants ruled as kings, dukes and counts within the European political system. Norse trading networks evolved into Hanseatic connections that would dominate northern European commerce for centuries. Scandinavian shipbuilding and maritime expertise continued to influence naval development throughout the medieval period and beyond. What ended was not Norse culture or influence, but a particular expression of that culture centred around raiding. The Vikings, who had burst onto the European stage as terrifying outsiders, completed their historical arc by becoming insiders, transformed by their encounters with the very societies they had once preyed upon, and transforming those societies in turn through their energy, adaptability, and distinctive cultural contributions. Recent scholarship has increasingly emphasised this transformative exchange rather than simple conflict. Archaeological evidence from across the Viking world reveals complex patterns of cultural interaction, with Norse settlers adopting local practices while introducing Scandinavian elements that would permanently alter host societies. Genetic studies confirm extensive intermarriage between Vikings and local populations in areas of settlement, creating hybrid communities with mixed heritage. Linguistic analysis shows how Norse vocabulary and grammatical structures influence languages from English to Russian, leaving permanent imprints on European communication. This more nuanced understanding of the Viking Age offers important historical lessons that transcend its specific context. It demonstrates how societies under threat can adapt and innovate, developing effective responses to seemingly overwhelming challenges. It shows how cultural interaction, even when beginning in violence, can ultimately produce synthesis rather than simple conquest or resistance. Perhaps most significantly, it illustrates how historical transformations often occur not through catastrophic collapses, but through gradual evolutionary processes that channel human energy from destructive to constructive forms. The tribes and kingdoms that successfully defeated Viking raiders didn't simply survive, they helped create the conditions for a new medieval order in which Norse energy would contribute to European development rather than threaten it. Their defensive innovations didn't just protect their own territories, but collectively transformed the strategic landscape in ways that made traditional Viking activities obsolete. As we close our exploration of this remarkable historical period, we can appreciate the sophisticated strategies developed by societies often dismissed as primitive or passive victims. From the Wends of the Baltic to the Muslims of al-Andalus, from the Byzantines to the Franks, from the Celts to the Eastern Slavs, all demonstrated resilience, innovation, and strategic thinking that would be impressive in any era. Their collective achievement reminds us that history is rarely as simple as popular narratives suggest. The Viking Age was neither a straightforward story of Norse domination nor a simple tale of victimhood and resistance. It was a complex interaction between expanding Scandinavian societies and the diverse cultures they encountered, an interaction that ultimately transformed both in profound and lasting ways. The monastery bells that rang in terror at Lindisfarne in 793 would, by the 12th century, ring out across a northern world where former raiders had become kings, traders, and settlers integrated into the European order. The longships that had once carried terror to distant shores had evolved into specialised vessels serving diverse economic and political functions. The warriors who had once seemed like demons from another world had become participants in a shared medieval civilization, still distinctive, still influential, but no longer the unstoppable force that had once threatened to overwhelm European society. In understanding how this transformation occurred, how the Viking Age reached its limits and eventually closed, we gain insight not just into a fascinating historical period, but into the broader patterns of human adaptation, resilience, and cultural evolution that continue to shape our world today. If you want more forgotten battles and vanished warriors, subscribe and join us for the next chapter.